You're watching CNN. I'm Julia Chatterley in New York, and we begin with the latest from Ukraine. An attempt to evacuate people from the embattled city of Mariupol is underway. Over the weekend, more than 100 civilians were ferried to safety from the besieged Azovstal steel plant, some seeing sunlight for the first time in weeks or even months. The plant came under fire again on Sunday night, though, according to Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, 2 explosions are reported in Russia's Belgorod region overnight too. This just a few hours after a large fire broke out at a military installation in the area. Russia has accused Ukraine of cross-border attacks on fuel depots and military facilities. And in Kharkiv, Ukrainian officials say 3 people were killed and injured in Russian shelling Sunday. And the United States stands with its NATO allies in support of Ukraine. That was the message from Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House of Representatives, when she met Polish President Andrzej Duda earlier. Her visit to Warsaw follows an unannounced visit to the Ukrainian capital on Saturday. In Kyiv, she met President Zelensky, telling him, "Your fight is a fight for everyone. Our commitment is to be there for you until the fight is done." Now, Nick Payton-Walsh is in Zaporizhia, where evacuees are expected to arrive from the steel plant in Mariupol. He spoke to my colleague John Berman earlier.
At this stage, we do not have evacuees from the Azovstal plant or from this specific convoy organised by the United Nations and Red Cross arriving here at the reception centre, where they would come in. You can see areas here that are being used over the past hours to welcome other evacuees from some, actually, the past days who've got out of Mariupol and been caught waiting in Russian-held territory and slowly move their way here. But all eyes, of course, are on these 2 separate moves out of Mariupol. I say 2 separate because we're talking firstly about the Azovstal steel plant, where a ceasefire allowed the first batch of individuals to get out. I have to quote Russian media here for some of the clearest numbers, but their suggestion was that 46 got out in the first 24-hour period, and in fact now we've seen another 80 in the second. The fate of those split, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, 11 choosing to stay in separatist territory, we'll have to take their word for that, and then 69 headed in this direction towards Zaporizhia. They have not arrived here if we are in fact indeed getting a clean readout from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Instead, Ukrainian officials, for their part, did in the last hours suggest that some of the buses, not these here, these will be the buses that eventually move people on from here, most likely to their next destination. Some of the buses have yet to meet people at meeting points. Let me just move around here and show you a little bit more about what we're seeing here. But this has become, of course, a move of enormous symbolic significance, not just because of the fate of those civilians caught under that steel plant and inside that besieged city over the past months, but because, of course, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky yesterday said from 8 o'clock they would be coming out and his team would welcome them here. That's where a lot of the welcome would happen, in some of these tents, adequate supplies here in what was just weeks ago, the outside of a shopping centre. But real, I think, expectations here certainly building that something may happen in the hours ahead. But I have to be honest with you, John, we haven't at this point heard any clear suggestion that the convoy is moving with evacuees. I'm talking about the larger convoy of civilians coming out of Mariupol, organised by the United Nations, but it's on its way specifically to us here. And so daylight hours are kind of limited, and there's a lot that could potentially go wrong here and a lot of confusing messages coming out. But the stakes are incredibly high, not just for those civilians caught there, 100,000 possibly in Mariupol, who will, as they travel, potentially gather more individuals who wish to follow their path out towards Ukrainian-held territory, but also, too, of course, because of the geopolitical machinations that have been involved in making this happen. The visit by UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres to Moscow, the conversation he had with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and the hopes, frankly, around the world that those suffering most in Mariupol, a city, frankly, levelled by Russia's brutal ambitions there, will find a way to get out. It's here where they'll arrive, but as I talk to you now, they haven't started coming from that actual mission of the humanitarian corridor, and there are concerns that we may not necessarily see them until tomorrow.
Nick Payton-Walsh reporting there earlier. Now, for the Ukrainian soldiers unable to leave the steel plant, the future remains uncertain. Now, while Russia promised humane treatment to anyone surrendering, even producing propaganda to promote that, CNN's Matt Rivers found evidence to the contrary, a warning. His story contains disturbing images and content.
Russian propaganda with a clear message to the last remaining defenders of Mariupol. The video says, "We guarantee that we will save your lives and we will follow international laws to guarantee humane treatment." Such will be the case, says the voiceover, with this man, a captured Ukrainian soldier, Dan Zvanek. The 25-year-old member of Ukraine's territorial defense force was captured at the Azovstal steel complex, the last remaining pocket of resistance in the city. CNN has geolocated the building behind them to an area just northwest of the plant. A Russian soldier detailing how they'll be treated. "As you are captured," he says, "we will treat you with honor and with understanding." These videos were published on April 20th. 5 days later, Dan Zvanek was dead. This picture of his face, hauntingly lifeless, was sent to his mother by officials in Russian-held Donetsk, she told us. We redialed the numbers and were hung up on once we identified as journalists. To confirm who he was, they also sent a picture of his chest with the tattoo on the body clearly matching the one seen on Zvanek when he was still alive in Russian propaganda videos.
When you first saw that message, what went through your mind?
Nothing. I just screamed. There was nothing. No thoughts.
We met his mother near where she's staying in Kyiv. She fled Mariupol herself just 2 weeks ago alongside the rest of her family. Her sister-in-law also reeling from the photo of her nephew.
I still have that photograph in front of my eyes. It's constantly in front of my eyes.
A morgue in Donetsk confirmed to CNN that Zvanek was dead and that his body was picked up on Sunday. His family says there was a large wound in the back of his head. CNN can't confirm how he died, but we know he died after being taken into custody, either by Russian or Russian-backed separatist forces.
Do you think that the Russians killed your son?
Yes, I'm sure.
Russia's Ministry of Defense did not return a request for comment about how Zvanek died. For weeks, CNN has heard directly from soldiers inside the steel plant complex who've told us they will not surrender to the Russians for fear of being executed. Within their ranks, Zvanek's death only hardened that sentiment.
Does what happened to him only reinforce the notion that the soldiers that are there are not going to surrender to the Russians?
Matt, don't you think it confirms their fear and actually expectations, what Russia did today? This is a war crime.
We asked Zvanek's mother, Anna, if she is angry with the Russians. Her answer, honest and gutting.
For now, I only feel enormous pain. Pain and emptiness. That's it.
Matt Rivers, CNN, Kyiv.
OK, let's get more from CNN's Scott McLean, who's in Lviv for us. Scott, I want to focus in on the explosions that have been reported in the Belgorod region across the border over in Russia. The Russians are pointing the finger at the Ukrainians, accusing them of targeting critical infrastructure. What more do we know about what happened here?
Hey, Julia. Yeah, so these explosions were reported by the governor of Belgorod, the region in Russia just across the border. Earlier this morning, there were 2 of them, apparently quite loud. This comes, or they say, sorry, I should say, that these explosions didn't cause any casualties. They didn't damage any infrastructure. This is what the Russians are saying, but they come just a day after there were another fire at a military installation on Russian soil in that same region again. And a few days after, just last week, there was a fire at a weapons depot in that very same region as well. Now, the Ukrainians haven't exactly owned up to these, but at least the one that last week, they might as well have, an advisor to the president saying that karma is a cruel thing. The Russian Foreign Ministry, Julia, has warned in the past. They've warned Kyiv, they've warned the West that strikes on Russian soil will be met with a swift response, and they further warned not to test Moscow's patience on this because they are determined to achieve their goals in what they call a special military operation. But this is part of a larger pattern. It's not just Belgorod. There have been sites all across Russian territory that have been hit with these mysterious fires. And if the Ukrainians are in fact behind some or all of them, then clearly they're not heeding that warning, Julia.
No, certainly not. Scott, I know something else that you're focusing on very closely, and it's southwest of Odessa and a Russian missile strike for the third time, I believe, on a critical bridge located in that region. I think we've got a map to show our viewers. What can you tell us about that bridge and why it's so important, both to the Russians and for the Ukrainians to hold?
Yeah, well, why it's important for the Russians, we're still trying to figure that out, but it is critical for the Ukrainians to have that bridge because it is the only link between that southwestern corner of Ukraine and the rest of the country. Any other way to get there has to, at least by land, by rail or by road, has to go through Moldova. And so this bridge is that critical link, and this is the third time now that it has been hit. It was hit once, they started to repair it, it was hit again. Surely, it's very likely they were trying to repair it again, and now it's been hit a third time. So the Russians seem determined that the Ukrainians will not be able to use that bridge, cutting off that portion of the country from the rest of itself. Obviously, we know that in Ukraine, air travel is not a thing, so any other way to get there would have to be either through Moldova or by boat potentially as well. It comes not long after a Russian military commander made very clear that the goal of this invasion is not only to take the eastern Donbas part of the country, but also to control the entire southern part of Ukraine along the Black Sea in order to link up with Transnistria, the separatist region of Moldova that has a large Russian-speaking population and also has a contingent of some 1,500 perhaps Russian troops there as well. There have been these mysterious explosions that have taken place in Transnistria in recent days. The Ukrainians say that they're trying to create tension with those. This bridge is obviously very close to that territory. So again, it's not clear exactly what the Russians are after here, but it is a very critical piece of infrastructure for Ukraine, Julia.
Yes, and crucial for port access too. Scott McLean, great to have you with us. Thank you so much for that. Now, EU energy ministers holding emergency talks today amid fears Russia will cut gas supplies to more countries that refuse to pay them in rubles. Ministers showing strong solidarity with Poland and Bulgaria, which both saw their supplies cut last week. The talks come as the EU appears to be moving closer to a phased-in ban on Russian oil. Claire Sebastian joins me now. Claire, enough to confuse our viewers here. So let's be clear what we're talking about. EU energy ministers discussing the cut-off of Bulgaria and Poland and what to do about gas supplies from Russia. But there does apparently seem rumours of movement on oil supplies from Russia and whether or not some kind of phased-in oil embargo can be agreed this week. Germany may be on board. What do we know?
Yeah, German participation would be crucial as the biggest importer of Russian energy and the biggest economy in Europe. Julia, what we know is that work is underway on a sixth package of sanctions that could, according to an EU spokesperson to me this morning, include sanctions on oil imports. It could also include further individual sanctions. Nothing is off the table, according to the spokesperson. And crucially, as I said, we heard from Germany, the economy minister last week, saying that you know, a phased ban on Russian oil could be, in his words, manageable. Part of the reason for that is that work is well and truly underway in Germany to reduce their reliance on Russian oil. They have gone, according to the economy minister, from 35% of their imports coming from Russia before the war to 12% now. So they are well on the way. That is why they think they could manage this, but there are countries who would find it much, much harder to manage, the likes of Hungary, which has already said that it could not even phase out Russian energy, and Slovakia, also a country that's very reliant on Russian oil. There are reports, there's a report from Reuters today that the EU might be considering, according to officials, a potential exemption for those two countries, either an exemption perhaps or a slower transition. That would be a way to sort of put forward a picture of European unity while at the same time not sort of alienating those countries who say they simply can't do it. So we expect that discussions will move forward on the sixth package of sanctions, but at the moment the focus appears to be, Julia, for this meeting today on the Russian actions last week, cutting off the gas to Poland and Bulgaria.
Yes, and what might come next? Claire, no doubt we will reconvene on this conversation. Thank you so much for that, Claire Sebastian there. Now, Beijing is doubling down yet again on the zero-COVID health policies that have resulted in a marked weakening of its economy. Beijing today announcing another round of mass PCR testing for more than 20 million residents to battle an uptick in COVID cases there. Officials also temporarily shutting down Beijing's Universal Studios during the ongoing Labor Day holiday. All this after a new report showing manufacturing activity in China contracting for a second straight month. Selena Wang is in the Kunming, China, where she's now on, I believe, day 10 of a 21-day quarantine. Selena, we will come back to what you're going through as far as that's concerned, but obviously you're facing these restrictions too. What more limits are being placed on people in the Beijing region to try and keep those cases down?
Yeah, Julie, what we were seeing in Beijing is authorities, they're cracking down fast and early to try and avoid a citywide lockdown and get away from the chaos and failures of the Shanghai citywide one. So right now, Beijing has only reported about 400 COVID cases since April 22nd, but already they're locking down parts of the cities, barring many people from leaving their homes. They've shut down a lot of entertainment venues like Universal Studios. They've shut down schools, a lot of public areas. And in addition to that, they're doing rounds and rounds of mass testing. This is a city of more than 20 million people. Just last week, they wrapped up 3 rounds of mass testing, and now this week, they're doing it all over again. On top of that, starting from May 5th, all residents need to show proof of negative PCR, negative COVID test to get into any public place. That's including public transportation. So as we see these ramped up restrictions in the capital, in Shanghai, still many of that city's 25 million residents, they've been locked in their homes for more than a month. So still, people there are growing more angry and more frustrated. But it's not just these big cities, Julia. Across China, at least 27 cities are under some form of lockdown. That's impacting about 180 million people across China. That's more than half of the U.S. population. And some of the extreme measures in China are causing outrage. For instance, in this area outside of Beijing, we see people are forced to hand over their keys to community workers so that they can lock them into their homes from the outside. And in the video, you can see that if people refuse, they actually are drilling holes into their walls to lock them in. In Shanghai, video has also shown some parts of the city fencing people into their homes. Now, all of these lockdown measures, they are really hurting China's economy. As we saw from that manufacturing data, we saw factory activity contracting for the second straight month, especially given that Shanghai is the country's industrial heart, financial hub. We're seeing all of these lockdowns impact the supply chain, impact factory operations. It's hurting the economy.
Absolutely. We were just showing some video of a door that appeared to be locked there with a piece of wire and a very flimsy looking padlock. I have to say in other countries that would certainly not stop people leaving their homes. And speaking of that, as I mentioned, you're on day 10 of a 21-day quarantine. You did a brilliant report that I suggest people watch. It's all over social media so people can see it, of what your experience was even just to get there. Selena, tell us what it's like to eat, how you're getting your meals, how you're managing.
Well, Julia, thank you for that. I mean, it's probably bizarre for a lot of our viewers in other parts of the world where people are learning to live with COVID, travel is starting to return to normal. Well, here in China, they're still guarded by some of the strictest border controls and the strictest quarantine in the world. So inbound travelers, they've got to go through a lengthy quarantine. So I traveled in from Tokyo into Kunming, which is 1,600 miles from Beijing, because that is the only direct flight we could find given how limited flights are. So I'm basically locked into this quarantine room for 21 days. I can only open my door to pick up food. They deliver 3 meals a day. You can't order any outside food. And they do multiple temperature checks a day, regular COVID tests. Sometimes I even get a COVID test twice a day, in fact. And also, several times a day, every few hours, I hear noises outside of people in full hazmat suits, the staff members disinfecting the hallways. Not only can I hear it, but I can smell it, that strong smell of alcohol seeping through the doors. All of this, it probably sounds extreme, but it's part of China's zero COVID policy. Critics say perhaps this is more politics than science, but authorities in China are saying they're sticking to this. In fact, they're even calling these policies China's magic weapon against COVID.
Yes, we were looking at pictures of your meals there as well, Selena. I believe, and you said you bought snacks from Tokyo to supplement your meals. I hope there was some chocolate in there too, because I have to say I would be really struggling. As serious as the story is, I'll be really struggling with that.
I've been just tearing through my I've been tearing through my dark chocolate reserves. I'm very scared because my rations are running out already and I'm only halfway through.
I knew you had a secret for looking so good. Selena, thank you for that. Hang in there. Selena Wang. All right, let me bring you up to speed with some of the other stories making headlines around the world. Parts of India and Pakistan are suffering intense heat waves that are putting the lives of millions at risk. Record high temperatures in recent weeks have damaged crops, forced schools to close and put pressure on energy supplies. Experts are warning of even more frequent heat waves that could affect over 1 billion people in both nations. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Germany on the first leg of a 3-day visit to Europe. Today he's meeting with Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Then it's on to Copenhagen, followed by a summit with leaders of Nordic nations. The trip comes as Prime Minister Modi is facing pressure from the West to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now coming up, rebuilding from the rubble. Russia's invasion has cost Ukraine's economy countless billions and the cost is rising all the time. More on what it will take to rebuild after this. Welcome back. As heavy shelling continues in eastern Ukraine, the Ukrainian government is already thinking about the long road to rebuilding the country. Ukraine's prime minister says during the first 6 weeks of the war, damage to Ukraine's economy exceeded $500 billion. And according to government estimates, damage in the long run could be $1 trillion, or 5 times Ukraine's GDP last year. A full-scale recovery will cost billions and will need global support. Now, part of that effort is Sergei Sivach. He is the executive director of Ukraine Invest, Ukraine's investment promotion office. Sergei, great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time. When we are talking about $1 trillion, it is a mind-blowing sum for anyone, never mind how big your nation's economy is. How are you framing that in the discussions that you're having with people that could potentially help?
It's a very significant amount for Ukraine, but not only for Ukraine, for any country worldwide. Let me give you some figures. What happened during these 62 days of unprovoked, illegal, criminal war aggression against Ukraine. Almost 23,000 kilometers of roads were destroyed. 32 million square meters of real estate, 535 kindergartens, 866 educational facilities, 173 factories in Ukraine were damaged, and 2 ports. And we also have no access to 4 ports in Ukraine. So you can see that this damage is very significant, and this is no longer a Ukrainian crisis. This is no longer a regional crisis. It's a global crisis. When we talk about FDIs alone, negative effect on FDIs is around $54 billion. Bearing in mind that in 2021, total FDI stock in Ukraine was $61 billion. You can imagine how serious this is for Ukraine. And as I said, this is a very serious case for the whole world.
Wow. I mean, I was writing those numbers down, and it's tough to get a grasp of. We'll break it down into where you begin, but I think to your point, when you're talking about 22,000 kilometers of Ukrainian roads damaged, and the country's still at war, you need to be rebuilding now, but there's also a battle to fight. Are people willing to provide money for the rebuilding now? Or are they saying, look, we'll give you money, but the war needs to be over, or what we invest may end up needing to be done again in a few weeks or months?
I would separate this into 2 issues. President Zelensky said that we have to start rebuilding economy and infrastructure, critical infrastructure right now. We cannot wait till the end of the war because country needs to operate. There was a high-level meeting in Washington, and we have seen significant support from international community, from international organizations and our partner countries. So we expect this support to come to Ukraine soon. But also we will have to talk later about private investment support. And we already, as governments of Ukraine, Investment Attraction and Support Office, we are working on programs for twinning cooperation. It's a very good approach. It could be used between Ukraine and other states, like, for example, United Kingdom said that they will support rebuilding of Kyiv, capital of Ukraine, and Kyiv region. Sweden, Denmark, they are happy to support rebuilding of Mykolaiv. But we can also talk about sectors of economy that can be rebuilt by big multinationals. As you know, Ukraine is very rich in terms of raw materials. We have 20 out of 30 critical raw materials. We are rich in terms of cobalt, lithium, zirconium, graphite, all these minerals of the future. So Ukraine will have to be rebuilt as a Ukraine 2.0. We cannot go back to raw materials economy anymore. We need to produce value-added goods. We can become center for production of electric batteries, electric vehicles for the whole Europe, for the whole world, for United States. We will need a lot of machinery to make sure that our agri sector will be more advanced. And we will need at least $20 billion for agri-processing equipment in order to produce more value-added products in Ukraine. So we have a lot of opportunities, and we're not asking the world just to give us money. We're talking about win-win case here, because when foreign companies, foreign investors will come to Ukraine, they will be able to help us, but also will help them to become stronger in terms of their interaction with global supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. We know a lot about the agricultural production because we've seen the impact in food prices all around the world. Sunflower oil production, I know, is a big one, but actually what caught my attention there was the lithium batteries, the neon that's required. I mean, that has global implications for the auto industry. So when you're talking about big multinationals, perhaps recognizing your importance in their supply chains, be they in the agricultural sector or in the auto sector, have some of them got in contact already and said, look, how can we help? Because to your point, this is an investment. This is not necessarily a gift. There is potential for them too to be involved.
Absolutely. I just came back from the Ukrainian border with Poland because we had high-level delegation from United States. I'm talking about businessmen, not state delegation. And they're already exploring opportunities. They want to help Ukraine, but they also interested in a long-term cooperation to develop mutually beneficial cooperation. When we talk about neon, very important that U.S. audience understands that 90% of neon-grade semiconductors that are used by U.S. automotive industry was produced in Ukraine, in the region of Mariupol. And when we talk about sunflower oil, Ukraine is the biggest worldwide exporter of sunflower oil. We export 50% of world sunflower oil market. And only about 9% of what we usually produce is being left in Ukraine, and more than 90% annually exported to the world. And we have seen that not only African, Asian, the East countries are affected, but also European countries and United Kingdom, because in United Kingdom, price of sunflower oil went up by 60%.
Okay, what can you tell me about Mariupol's production and how long it's going to take to rebuild, even in a situation where it's stabilized? Because again, we're going back to a critical supply for the global auto industry. What can you tell me about supplies, how much time it's going to take to rebuild there, assuming we can? Because I think we've had these kind of images of Mariupol and the devastation there burned into our minds.
Mariupol city is fully destroyed. Kharkiv city, the city that is near Russian border, like 30 miles, they have more than 1,000 buildings destroyed, but Mariupol city is just demolished. So I would probably say that we need to wait till end of active phase of war operation, then we can assess how long it will take and how much will be needed. It will take a year or two to rebuild quickly. And it can take 5 or 10 years or 15 years if this support, the rebuilding support, will not be effective enough or it will not be significant enough. Mariupol port alone is the biggest metal transshipment center from Ukraine, and it was the fifth biggest seaport in Ukraine. So the region is very important. But it is very hard to say now, how long it will take, and much will depend on pressure of the world on Russia. They have to stop what they're doing. They have to stop doing criminal activity and this unprovoked, as I said, illegal aggression against Ukraine.
Sergei, let's circle back. Final question on critical infrastructure, utilities, electricity, water, the basics for people to be able to live. Have you had private investor interest in perhaps coming in, helping you rebuild, modernize those kind of utilities? Again, there's return potential there for a private investor.
We already have this request, and actually today we have received a request from a potential U.S. investor who is interested to enter semiconductor business in Ukraine. They already make this assessment, and the water supplies and other strategic directions that are needed for Ukrainian economy. We received many requests, and we already do meetings in Kyiv. All of them say same thing. So as soon as this war ends, we will enter Ukraine. We have seen requests from foreign countries. They are saying that they will relocate their facilities from other countries to Ukraine just because they think it will be a right thing to do. And they wait when this will end. So a lot of requests. We are working on that, but we are not just waiting for the end of the war in Ukraine. We're already doing our analytics. We're doing our proposals. So I think there will be a lot of opportunities for impact investors, companies that will be interested to make profit, but they will be making profit on a bit different kind of level. They will have a lesser profit maybe at the beginning. But then, after Ukraine will be reintegrated in global supply chains, they will benefit, and we'll be happy to see our international friends making business with us on a win-win basis.
Right, now we just pray for peace. Sergi, great to get you on. Thank you so much for all the information, and a lot of work to be done, but good to see you're already getting cracking on it. Sergi Tsivac, the Executive Director of Ukraine Invest. Thank you, sir. You too. We're back after this. Welcome back. A reminder of our top stories today. Officials say a civilian evacuation from the devastated city of Mariupol is underway, but there are delays in getting the buses to the pickup points. The fate of people still sheltering in the Azovstal steel plant remains uncertain. More than 100 were evacuated on Sunday, but Ukraine says hundreds do remain. The plant came under heavy shelling overnight too, and there is no word whether the next phase of that evacuation can still go ahead. Ukraine's military says Russian forces are pressing forward in an offensive towards the eastern Donetsk region, specifically the town of Slavyansk. As Russia continues with its offence in Ukraine's east, it's also clamping down on dissent at home. Moscow is designating critics of the government foreign agents, imposing severe restrictions on their freedom of speech. Many of them are choosing to leave the country. Among them is Ekaterina Shulman. She's a political scientist and Kremlin critic, even though she served on Vladimir Putin's Presidential Council for Civil Society and Human Rights until he dismissed her in 2019. The Kremlin designated her a foreign agent last month, just after she announced she was leaving Moscow for Berlin for a year. She's a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy. And Ekaterina joins us now. Great to have you on the show. I've heard you say in podcasts that you were expecting to be designated a foreign agent, but perhaps the reality is different. How does it feel now?
This is not something that one expects. It's not a birthday present or a New Year celebration. And frankly, I don't think the public would be very much interested in my interior emotions. But given the tempo of this list being filled with new and new names every Friday, and these names all being familiar people, and especially when one saw the broadening circle of, I would say, social strata included into this foreign agents registry. First, it was mostly NGO activists, especially those who dealt with election observation, then journalists, then came academicians, teachers, even one painter, and video bloggers, and then it became more or less evident that my turn would come one Friday or the other. By the way, I would like to note that last Friday, for some reason, went without the usual news from the Ministry of Justice, so no new foreign agents. Evidently, they went on their May vacations already. But we will expect them back with more news and more expected presence next Friday, I suppose.
You know, those that are familiar with your work and your podcasts, I know you're punchy, but I think they see you also as a voice of calm amid great uncertainty. And I've noticed a consistent thread in your comments was that you felt like you needed to be in Moscow to make your point, to spread your word and to send the message and to get through to the people that needed to hear you. How does being outside of Moscow change that and perhaps how you send your message? And do you still feel like your place is in Moscow and in Russia, if not perhaps this Russia?
When I was back in my country, I was a rather persistent opponent to immigration. It has always been my position that while staying in your place and doing your job is physically possible, it's better to use this opportunity while it lasts. And maybe I can say for myself that I used it while it was possible till maybe the very, very last moment. You know that after February 24th, many people left immediately. More people left within a few weeks. I will not say that it's a particular badge of honor for me to have stayed a few weeks longer than the others. But still, while there was no direct threat of, let's say, frankly, criminal prosecution, then of course we who are public speakers and teachers and scholars, we try to stay where we belong. One can't avoid feeling that a word spoken from outside of the country is fraught with much less risk, and therefore it's much less valuable. You get freedom of speech, but this speech loses its about half of its consequence. But on the other hand, those who stay are more and more forced to be completely silent or to speak of non-political subjects. And I'm a political scientist. You have designated me a Kremlin critic. I don't think my main job was to criticize the Kremlin. I study legislative process and parliamentarism. And this is what I taught to my students while I had the opportunity of teaching. This is what I wrote about. And I was very much in the Duma in the Russian parliament during the last, 20 years. So I can't say that I'm a radical oppositional figure. And maybe my experience tells something about the transformation that Russian political sphere and public sphere in general has undergone in those very few last weeks.
You know, you could make the argument too that you may be slightly safer somewhere else, but as history, I think, has proved, you're still not perfectly safe being outside of Moscow and Russia, even if you're around the world. You know, I think what I'd love to get your take on is the informational war that's taking place. And you said at the beginning of this interview, no one's interested in your emotional response. But actually, I think we are, as non-Russians watching this, interested in Russian people's response to what we're seeing. And whether in some ways, and I think it's human nature, it's perhaps easier to believe a lie than it is to accept the truth. Do you think there's some element of that in Russian people's acknowledgement or understanding of what we're seeing today? And will that change? What changes that? Whether it's Putin's behavior or what we see in this war?
Well, since the February 24th, the situation we found ourselves in was so, to put it mildly, uncomfortable, unbearable, that I can understand the temptation to accept any version, however primitive, any version that would offer you a vestige of comfort, any picture, even taken from state TV, that will still make you believe that you are a good person living in a good place, that you are comparatively safe, that the world has not broken into pieces. I can perfectly understand the temptation. I feel it myself. So especially in recent weeks and days, I have been judging much more mildly those people who support the official version of events, because truth is hardly bearable. The catastrophe is too palpable to, at the same time, it's palpable and it's impossible to look it fully in the face. I'm a scholar. It's my duty to study political reality, and I find it hard to even read the news, to say nothing of analyzing them. So again, when you hear and see people who say it's a special military operation, it's for our own good, we had no other choice, we're fighting the Nazis, etc., keep in mind that possibly in their hearts there's this daily, hourly fear and anxiety and horror and general impossibility to adapt to this reality. It's like nothing we have experienced before. It's not like 2014. It's not like 2008. It's a whole new reality, and it's extremely hard to come to terms with. Time must, well, we do hope time will do something at adapting. We human creatures tend to adapt to almost anything that happens. But now we are in what we may call an acute phase of what is happening. No signs of hostilities abating, no light in the end of any tunnel that you can possibly look into.
I guess the question is, when does that perhaps turn inward and turn on Putin? But Ekaterina, I'm out of time. Please come back on the show. We had some technical issues in the beginning, or I would have had more time with you, but I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you for your time and your wisdom. Ekaterina Schulman, Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy. More First Move after the break. Welcome back. Lots of April showers for global investors and not a lot of Mayflowers just yet. US stocks beginning the new trading month little changed after the worst monthly drop for tech stocks since 2008. Weakness in Europe too. All this ahead of an extremely busy few days for investors, including a Fed rate decision on Wednesday and fresh US jobs numbers on Friday. Let me just give you a sense for the year. The S&P and the Nasdaq have fallen well over 10%. The Nasdaq, far and away the worst performer, now down more than 20%. The once mighty FANG tech stocks well and truly defanged this year once again too. Take a look at Netflix, down almost 70% since January. Regulatory risk, just one reason for tech's underperformance. The EU today taking aim at Apple, warning the company that it's unfairly blocking competitors from using the technology behind Apple Pay. We've heard that warning before. And blunt talk from Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway CEO Warren Buffett criticizing Wall Street during his annual shareholder meeting over the weekend, saying larger American companies have become, quote, poker chips for market speculation. Christine Romans joins me now. Christine, just one of fascinating comments that came out of this meeting, actually, and always does. And Robinhood, also the trading app, not spared the criticism. And obviously that share price has had a shocker this year as well.
That's exactly right. Well, first off, just on the whole gambling parlor, as he called it, mentality on Wall Street, he has said things like this before, but he said the last couple of years, Julia, it's been even worse, where you have people who are essentially speculators encouraged to make money by speculation, not necessarily investment. And we know he's a big investment guy, right? And he says, ironically, that is what creates value for him, because then they can step back and they can look and see what Wall Street has beaten down and they can find value. And indeed they did in the first quarter of the year, somewhat $41 billion worth of purchases. But a warning again from the Oracle of Omaha about the speculative nature of Wall Street. Julia.
One of the quotes that came out of this as well. Sometimes markets do crazy things. That's good for Berkshire, not because we're smart, but because we are sane. Yes, I like that point. But you know what also caught my attention? Stupid and evil. What are we talking about, Christine Raymond?
We're talking about cryptocurrencies here. And Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett are not fans of crypto, just the opposite. You know, Warren Buffett actually saying, look, I can value Priceland. Or farmland, rather. I know how to price an apartment building. He said, I wouldn't give $25 for all of the crypto, all the Bitcoin in the world. And then Charlie Munger was even more dire. And he has been very, very sharp about crypto before. He called it stupid and evil. And he said, the one thing he doesn't want to be is more foolish than everybody else in the room. If you buy crypto, you are that person. You are both. It is stupid, evil, and you are the fool. So they're really talking about how this is not something that stores value. It's not something that you can rate what kind of value it holds, the way you can rate other commodities or stocks or other instruments. And they're very, very, very out there about their aversion to it. I will say, though, the crypto bros are not going to care. They're going to say these guys are investment dinosaurs, honestly, right? And they just don't get it. Warren Buffett says, I don't get the value. This is not something I'm engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, that comment was really quite strange to me. I understand what he said. Farmland has a rental yield. It produces food, apartments. You can get rent from the apartments. I wouldn't buy the whole of the Bitcoin market for $25. I would, and then I'd sell it at current market prices and make an absolute killing. Something strange about that comment. Christine Romans, thank you for that.
I'll put in $13.50. We can split it together, right? We'll each.
It's a deal, my friend. Thank you. More after this. Stay with us. We leave you with a powerful moment from New York's Metropolitan Opera over the weekend. That's Ukrainian soprano Lyudmila Monostienko, who performed the title role of Turandot, then took her curtain call draped in the Ukrainian flag. And that's it for the show. Stay safe. Connect the World is up next, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Today, we've done 2 lots of 18 bodies and another 10, 46 in total.
As a trickle of people escape Mariupol's steel plant, hundreds are buried in graves, marked only with a number. There are no final goodbyes. And
do you think that the Russians killed your son?
Yes, I'm sure.
this mother found out that her soldier son was dead when the Russians sent her a photo. She has many questions and a heart full of pain. Plus, as sanctions rain down on Russia, the Indian government continues to buy cheap Russian oil. We're watching Berlin as the German Chancellor meets with India's Prime Minister. Hello and welcome. I'm Eleni Jakos in Abu Dhabi. This is Connect the World. We begin with the evacuations in besieged Mariupol. An advisor to the city's mayor says an evacuation of the general population towards Zaporizhia began several hours ago, but progress is reported to be very slow. At last report, buses had not yet arrived at the main assembly points. Now, these are not the same people who are holed up inside the Azovstal steel plant. About 100 women and children left the plant Sunday. One of those evacuees voicing disbelief at finally seeing daylight again. Take a listen.
I can't believe it. 2 months of darkness. We did not see any sunlight. We were scared.
Well, after they left, Russian attacks resumed. A commander inside described a turbulent night there. These satellite photos show massive destruction at that plant after weeks of being pummeled by Russian weapons. The commander says about 200 civilians remain inside the plant, including 20 children, and he's begging for them to get out. Meantime, Ukraine's military says Russian forces are pressing forward in eastern Ukraine ahead of an anticipated attack on a key town in the Donetsk region. Ukraine's president again asking, what is the point of all of this destruction and bloodshed?
What could be Russia's strategic success in this war? Honestly, I do not know. The ruined lives of people and the burned or stolen property will give nothing to Russia. It will only increase the toxicity of the Russian state and the number of those in the world who will work to isolate Russia.
Inside Russia, the governor of the Belgorod region reports 2 explosions early Monday, and that follows a large fire Sunday at a defense ministry complex. Mariupol's mayor reports that more than 20,000 people killed there since the invasion began. And CNN can't confirm that, but Sarah Seidner shows us the difficult and heartbreaking task of burying the city's dead.
No tears, no remembrances, no final goodbyes, just dust to dust, and the burial is over.
We bury 50 people a day. Today, we've done 2 lots of 18 bodies and another 10, 46 in total.
Gravediggers like Danya can barely keep up the pace at the Starry Cream Cemetery in the outskirts of Mariupol. One's marked with only a number, a sign the bodies have yet to be identified by family.
People come and find their loved ones and bring crosses and a board.
CNN is not present in the Russian-occupied Donbass, but footage we obtained and satellite images show dozens of fresh graves. Local authorities say about 600 in total, and this is not an isolated case. Images show graves have been dug en masse at 2 other burial grounds. This is one of them, Manush. They've been bringing bodies every day for a month, Anna says. They just keep bringing more and more, bit by bit. Here, too, footage shows rows of freshly dug graves and indications bodies have been buried before being identified.
Each body is given its own grave and a coffin and a board with a number.
A separatist soldier who did not want to be identified says,
after they are processed, the city funeral service works with the prosecutor's office to organize their burial.
CNN could not independently verify the claims, but local authorities say the majority of those buried here and in Starry Cream were killed during Russia's assault on Mariupol. Moscow has now seized control of most of this strategic port city, but some Ukrainian forces continue to hold ground at the Azovstal steel plant. So far, the Kremlin hasn't reported an official death toll, but Ukrainian officials say it's in the thousands.
By our optimistic estimation, more than 20,000 people, women, kids, elderly, died on the streets of our city.
The mayor of Mariupol says, because the death toll is bound to rise, at Manush, the work continues. About 100 freshly dug graves ready for the dead. As war rages, Ukrainians aren't just being murdered by strangers, but also buried by them. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Kyiv.
All right, important information coming out about the horrors in Mariupol, but we want to take you now to Zaporizhia, the city in the eastern Ukraine. Is often where people evacuated from Mariupol go first. Our international security editor, Nick Payton-Walsh, is there and joins us now live. Nick, really important day, you know, in terms of getting people out of that steel plant and headed to hopefully where you are. Has there been any movement and any people arriving as yet?
Yes, there has been movement. No, as far as we can see here, there have not been arrivals who were in the shelter beneath the Azovstal steel plant, or a part of this broader United Nations Red Cross move to here. We've seen a drip slowly of vehicles arriving here. Behind me is a bus that came carrying individuals from Kherson, one of the first towns that Russia occupied, and there have been other vehicles that have arrived here carrying people, some from Mariupol, who've been leaving over the past week. But the expectations, the focus today is on this larger move facilitated by the UN and the Red Cross, touted by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, that it would begin today at 8 a.m. And certainly there are indications that people are on the move from the centre of Mariupol, which is, of course, nearly entirely under Russian occupation. I understand from two officials here, though, that they're not expected imminently, perhaps not in daylight hours here yet, maybe even tomorrow. That's echoed by another Ukrainian official who they also talked about how a matter of hours ago the buses were heading towards meeting points and may not have collected individuals yet. I understand they may now necessarily be on the move, but it's here that they would come to, and a variety of different people coming out of Mariupol, to those from the steel plant, the final place bombarded intensely. We're hearing from those still there that there are hundreds of wounded Ukrainian soldiers still possibly in that building, and well over 100, it seems, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, that have emerged. 69 headed this way as of the last 24 hours, people who emerged, and according to the Russian Defense Ministry, 11 have chosen to stay in separatist territory. Make of that what you will in terms of its veracity. But outside of that, there are still 100,000 civilians in Mariupol, with the threat of disease from the lack of basic utilities there, from the number of bodies in the streets and under the rubble of that heavily besieged city, who may seek to get out at some point. That is what here is for, the evacuation centre, and it may well in the days ahead become flooded with those thousands as this UN route gets underway, if indeed it does get to operate at that kind of volume. So much of this requiring Russian military cooperation and trust on both sides, which frankly since the beginning of this war obviously has been in short supply. Eleni?
Nick, thank you so much for that insight. And importantly, and we have to stress, there are still over 100,000 people in Mariupol, but importantly, getting people out of the steel plant is priority right now. Nick, we'll check in with you later. Thanks so much. Germany and India both coming under pressure to do more for Ukraine. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Berlin, face-to-face talks with his German counterpart. The German Chancellor rejecting criticism that Berlin isn't showing leadership in Western efforts to supply Ukraine with heavy weapons. And despite international pressure, India continues to buy Russian oil. And at this hour, EU energy ministers are holding a crisis meeting in Brussels after Russia turned off its gas supply to Poland and Bulgaria last week. Moscow wants energy payments in rubles to get around sanctions. Warsaw and Sofia said no way. Today, the EU is trying to come up with a unified response to Moscow's demand. For his part, the Ukrainian foreign minister tweeted that a Russian oil embargo must be included in the next round of sanctions. CNN's Claire Sebastian is watching all of this from London and joins us now live. I tell you, the situation, the energy situation in Europe is absolutely evolving, with Bulgaria and Poland now being cut off, and of course talk of a sixth round of sanction. The question is, will there be an alliance and camaraderie when it comes to an embargo on oil from Russia, and will Germany play along?
So, Eleni, it seems that Germany will play along. We heard just today, as he arrived at this extraordinary meeting of EU energy ministers, Robert Habeck, who's the German Minister for Economy and Climate, he said, look, after 2 months of work on this, Germany is now ready to support an oil embargo on Russian imports. He says that Germany has gone from 35% dependence on Russian oil in terms of its imports down to 12% since the start of the war. That is a really big change. He says that if it now affects only one refinery in Germany, that's still 12%. So he says they would have a local problem if this were to happen. But they are ready to move ahead with this. It's clear, though, that not everyone in the EU is. The likes of Hungary has said that very clearly that it doesn't think it would be able to do this, that it's not going to do this. It said it's going to pay in rubles for Russian gas. Slovakia is also one in focus because of their very high dependency on Russian oil. But we are seeing momentum, and there's even reportedly, according to Reuters, a potential sort of policy on the table that would sort of carve out Hungary and Slovakia from an embargo, give them perhaps more time to transition, or even an exemption. So the work is moving ahead with this. An EU spokesman saying to me today that individual sanctions plus economic sanctions on oil could be part of the 6th package. Nothing is off the table, he said.
Yeah, okay, so let's quickly talk about India and Germany and, of course, Narendra Modi. An important tour in Europe, but we know the Indians are still buying Russian commodities. What is going to be said in the messaging around this tour, and of course to try and get more emerging markets into this Western alliance against Russia?
Yeah, so this is Narendra Modi's really first foreign trip since the pandemic. He hasn't been abroad in a while. The German Chancellor in a press conference just now saying he was very pleased that he had made the decision to make that trip to Germany. He's going to carry on and go to Copenhagen and then Paris after that. But look, the elephant in the room here is Indian neutrality. India has sort of sat on the fence throughout the conflict in Ukraine, refused to directly condemn Russia, abstained from various UN votes on the issue. And meanwhile, certainly according to experts, they have been the biggest buyer of what's called distressed barrels from Russia, oil that, because of sort of self-sanctioning and reputational issues, Western companies, even without an embargo, have not been buying. India has been buying those at a discount. So what we've seen is a sort of loose, I guess, campaign to persuade India over to the Western side. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, was there. Boris Johnson is there. And we've heard very strong language from German Chancellor Scholz this morning on the situation in Ukraine, condemning it, calling on Putin again to end the war. Eleni.
All right, Clay Sebastian, thank you so much. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is in Europe to rally support for the Ukrainian war effort. On Monday, she led a U.S. congressional delegation that met with Polish President Andrzej Duda. Pelosi said the visit shows that the U.S. stands firmly alongside NATO allies in supporting Ukraine. She also met with President Zelensky during a surprise visit to Ukraine over the weekend. CNN's congressional reporter Lauren Fox is tracking Speaker Pelosi's European tour. Great to see you, Lauren. A surprise visit as well, seeing Zelensky. What is the overall aim of Pelosi's visit?
Well, this is to show support, and this comes after President Biden released that $33 billion supplemental request in military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine. Pelosi making it clear to Zelensky over the weekend that lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats, are supportive of getting more resources to Ukraine. They are supportive of making sure that that happens quickly. But here in the United States and on Capitol Hill, there are some obstacles to getting that money out to Ukraine and fast. Essentially, the House of Representatives is out of session this week. That will slow the process. There's also some significant concerns from some Republicans about exactly where this $33 billion is being allocated. So while this was a message of support for Zelensky and for Europe, this was also a moment to rally support back here at home for this $33 billion supplemental package that is badly needed for Ukraine.
All right, Lauren, thank you very much. Great to see you. Israel is blasting the Russian foreign minister after he used an anti-Semitic trope to justify the invasion of Ukraine. We'll have a live report from Jerusalem. And Beijing clamps down to control its latest COVID outbreak. More mass testing and more public venues shut down. How the rules are affecting millions of people as China marks a 5-day holiday. All coming up on Connect the World. Outrageous, unforgivable lies. That's how furious Israeli officials are condemning comments from Russia's foreign minister. Sergei Lavrov said Adolf Hitler had Jewish blood and repeated Russia's claim that it's trying to denazify Ukraine, even though its president is Jewish. Lavrov made the comments Sunday on Italian television. Israel's foreign minister said has summoned now the Russian ambassador for a meeting about those remarks. Meantime, about 200,000 people observed Eid Monday at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Authorities say there were no conflicts at that gathering, but over the weekend, violence in the region left at least one Israeli man and a Palestinian man dead. CNN's Hadas Gold is covering both of these stories for us in Jerusalem. A weekend of violence and an important religious weekend as well for Muslims in Jerusalem. Give us a sense of what happened, Hadas.
Well, those images we're seeing this morning are very peaceful. We saw 200,000 people or so praying during Eid at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. But this weekend did see some violence here in this region that began Friday night when an Israeli security guard who was guarding one of the largest Israeli settlements in the West Bank, it's called Ariel, two men in a car approached the guard tower where he was sitting and opened fire, killing him. Israeli officials say that they later arrested two Palestinian suspects in the attack. And the Palestinian militant group, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, has taken credit. Then later Friday night and into Saturday morning, a Palestinian man was shot and killed by Israeli forces in a town called Azun in the West Bank. Now, after the attack in Ariel where the Israeli security guard was shot, the Israeli military went on a manhunt for the two suspects, were setting up roadblocks that may have helped lead to clashes in this town in Azun. The IDF said that that suspects threw Molotov cocktails at them and that they responded with live fire, killing that 27-year-old Palestinian man. Then at his funeral, there were further clashes on Saturday with Israeli forces. Palestinian Red Crescent said 3 people were injured with live fire. The IDF said again they were responding to what they called violent rioters. This has already been a deadly and violent past few months. There have been attacks in Israel that have killed 14 people. The Israeli military has been stepping up its raids across the West Bank and what they say are counterterrorism operations. At least 20 Palestinians have been killed. And of course, we've seen many tensions and clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem. Although today was peaceful and we are seeing the end of Ramadan, Israeli officials say that they are still expecting more days of tension ahead, especially as Israeli Independence Day will be celebrated this Thursday. Eleni.
I also want to talk about Russia's foreign minister's comments, Sergei Lavrov, inflammatory comments coming through. And it's been sort of an interesting turn of events for the Israelis. Do you think that they'll be taking a stronger stance, being more vocal about the war in Ukraine, given the latest comments from Lavrov?
Well, first of all, the comments from Lavrov, they're sort of these conspiracy theory tropes that Hitler was somehow Jewish. And he also said that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews. And this is, he said, trying to justify how they're trying to denazify, as they say, Ukraine, when Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is Jewish himself. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Museum, has also called these unfounded. We're seeing a pretty harsh reaction from the Israelis. Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, has spoken out against them, calling them lies. The foreign minister, Yair Lapid, was even stronger in his remarks. I'll read some of what he said. He said that the remarks are both unforgivable and outrageous and a terrible historical error. He says Jews did not murder themselves in the Holocaust. The lowest level of racism against Jews, he says, is to accuse Jews themselves of anti-Semitism. Now, these statements are notable because I do believe it's the first time Israel has publicly condemned the Russian claim that Volodymyr Zelensky is somehow a Nazi, but I do not think that this will necessarily lead, for example, to Israel to fully join the Western sanctions against Russia. Israel still finds itself in this sort of diplomatic, delicate balance between the two countries. It still wants to act as mediators. Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, had been speaking with Zelensky and Putin. Israel also says it's very concerned about the hundreds of thousands of Jews in both countries. Now, Israel has condemned the invasion. They've called out what they say are Russia war crimes. They've provided humanitarian aid, but I do not think this specific event will lead to, for example, them joining the Western sanctions against Russia. Eleni.
Hadas Gold, thank you very much for that update. Now, a major escalation of COVID restrictions in Beijing As China marks its 5-day Labor Day holiday, restaurant dining in the capital has been shut down, and people will soon be required to have a negative COVID test to enter public venues. Also Monday, local authorities announced 3 more rounds of COVID testing for 20 million people. There are fears Beijing is heading towards a Shanghai-style lockdown, and many local governments have told people not to leave their cities unless absolutely necessary. Our Selena Wang is in Kunming in southwestern China. Selena, I can't imagine the logistical nightmare to try and get 20 million people to go for testing. But what are you hearing about their experience? And it seems that we've seen this escalation, that things are getting worse as opposed to better.
Well, we're seeing Beijing authorities essentially here. They are rushing to ramp up these restrictions aggressively and quickly to try and avoid an entire citywide lockdown. They do not want to see the kind of chaos and failures that we saw during Shanghai's lockdown. So we're seeing relative organization here, even though there's been some panic buying. Anecdotally, residents are saying that store shelves are still stocked, but of course people are preparing in case things turn to the worst. So we're seeing ramped up restrictions. Beijing has banned in-restaurant dining. They're suspending schools. They're closing down major entertainment venues, including Universal Studios. And during this Labor Day holiday that started over this weekend, they're urging people not to travel. On top of that, they're rolling out another 3 rounds of mass testing this week. This is after they already wrapped up 3 rounds just last week for more than 20 million residents. So this takes major organization and manpower. And on top of that, they're also starting from May 5th going to require residents to show a negative PCR test in order to enter any public venue, including public transportation. And this is as Shanghai, many of their 25 million residents have been sealed in their homes for more than a month, fueling more anger and frustration. But it's not just these major cities. Across China, at least 27 cities are under some form of lockdown, impacting around 180 million people. That's more than half of the US population. And some of the more extreme measures are sparking outrage. Shanghai, they've put up some fences to barricade COVID-hit areas. Outside of Beijing, social media video shows that some residents had to hand over their keys to community workers so they could lock them into their apartments from the outside. And if they refused, they would actually drill holes into the walls outside of their doors to chain their door shut. All of this, people are getting fatigued by many of these policies, but still China doubling down on that zero COVID strategy.
Yeah. So Selena, tell me what day of quarantine you're in at the moment, when you plan to get out, and what your experience has been. I know it's tough. Are you doing jumping jacks to get your heart rate up? Give me a sense of a day in a life of being stuck somewhere with not being able to go to the outside world.
Well, I've got a yoga mat, I've got a jump rope, some weights, so trying to get steps every day and exercise amid 21 days of confinement. I can only open my door to get the 3 food pickups a day. I get multiple knocks a day for temperature checks, COVID tests. Sometimes I'm even COVID tested twice a day. And also, every few hours, I can hear the noise of workers in full hazmat suits disinfecting the hallway. And I can also smell it when they're doing that, the scent of alcohol seeping through the windows. And this may seem very extreme, especially for our viewers in many parts of the world where travel is returning to normal, where people are learning to live with COVID. But here in China, these strict border control rules, the harshest quarantine in the world, this is all part of the country's zero COVID policy. It is so incredibly difficult to come into this country from overseas, so it's no surprise we've seen such a major drop in people trying to get in.
I have to say, your food doesn't look very appetizing. I was stuck in Greece and I was getting really good food for the whole day. I wish you luck and hope to see you out of there very soon. Thanks, Selena. All right, let's get you up to speed now on some other stories that are on our radar right now. Heartwarming scenes from New Zealand as the country opens up to travelers from dozens of countries. COVID-vaccinated visitors from 60 visa waiver countries, including the US, the UK and Singapore, do not have to quarantine. The border will stay closed for all other visitors until October. Qantas is planning the world's largest non-stop passenger flights, 19 hours from Sydney to London or New York. The airline announced Project Sunrise today and hopes it can take off by the end of 2025. This is the first of several ultra-long-haul routes Qantas has planned. Actors Johnny Depp and Amber Heard are back in a U.S. court Monday. Sources say Heard switched crisis communications firms ahead of her expected testimony. Depp is suing his ex-wife for defamation and Heard is countersuing. The judge says she wants this trial wrapped up by the end of May. And still ahead, the pain of one mother after her son, a Ukrainian soldier, was captured in Mariupol and never came home. That story when we return. Welcome back. I'm Eleni Jakos in Abu Dhabi, and you're watching Connect the World. Freedom and the light of day. Some of the dozens of people evacuated from a giant steel plant in Mariupol are voicing disbelief at finally seeing sunlight again after being trapped there for 2 months. But hundreds of others are still said to be inside the bombed-out complex. The mayor describes the process of moving people away from Mariupol very difficult and dependent on Russia's cooperation. Meanwhile, an evacuation of the general population in Mariupol has begun, but progress is reported to be very slow. Inside Russia, 2 explosions were reported in the Belgorod region early Monday. That follows a large fire Sunday at a defense ministry complex. More than 5.5 million people have fled Ukraine, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. More than 7 million are internally displaced. CNN's Matt Rivers is following all the developments in Mariupol, and he joins us now live from the Ukrainian capital. Matt, I have to say, as we're starting to get more information about what people are experiencing in Mariupol and importantly at the steel plant, it is harrowing to think about what they've endured for the past 2 months and now a glimmer of hope in trying to get out. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, I mean, it's good news that people are leaving Mariupol. It hasn't happened for weeks now, and so the fact that even if it is small numbers, civilians getting out is a very good thing, including the relatively small numbers of people that have managed to leave this steel plant complex. But as we watch civilians leave, we also have open questions, a number of questions about what will happen to the soldiers that remain inside that steel plant complex. One of the questions has been, will they eventually surrender to the Russians? And I think the answer to that is no, especially given the story that we are about to show you. And I should warn our viewers that what is about to be shown is disturbing to some, with some graphic images. Russian propaganda with a clear message to the last remaining defenders of Mariupol. The video says, we guarantee that we will save your lives and we will follow international laws to guarantee humane treatment. Such will be the case, says the voiceover, with this man, a captured Ukrainian soldier, Dan Zvanek. The 25-year-old member of Ukraine's territorial defense force was captured at the Azovstal steel complex, the last remaining pocket of resistance in the city. CNN has geolocated the building behind them to an area just northwest of the plant. A Russian soldier detailing how they'll be treated. As you are captured, he says, we will treat you with honor and with understanding. These videos were published on April 20th. 5 days later, Dan Zvanek was dead. This picture of his face, hauntingly lifeless, was sent to his mother by officials in Russian-held Donetsk, she told us. We redialed the numbers and were hung up on once we identified as journalists. To confirm who he was, they also sent a picture of his chest with the tattoo on the body clearly matching the one seen on Zvanek when he was still alive in Russian propaganda videos.
When you first saw that message, what went through your mind?
Nothing. I just screamed. There was nothing. No thoughts.
We met his mother near where she's staying in Kyiv. She fled Mariupol herself just 2 weeks ago alongside the rest of her family. Her sister-in-law also reeling from the photo of her nephew.
I still have that photograph in front of my eyes. It's constantly in front of my eyes.
A morgue in Donetsk confirmed to CNN that Zvanek was dead and that his body was picked up on Sunday. His family says there was a large wound in the back of his head. CNN can't confirm how he died, but we know he died after being taken into custody, either by Russian or Russian-backed separatist forces.
Do you think that the Russians killed your son?
Yes, I'm sure.
Russia's Ministry of Defense did not return a request for comment about how Zvanek died. For weeks, CNN has heard directly from soldiers inside the steel plant complex who've told us they will not surrender to the Russians for fear of being executed. Within their ranks, Zvanek's death only hardened that sentiment. Does what happened to him only reinforce the notion that the soldiers that are there are not going to surrender to the Russians?
Matt, don't you think it confirms their fear and actually expectations, what Russia did today? This is a war crime.
We asked Zvanek's mother, Anna, if she is angry with the Russians. Her answer, honest and gutting.
For now, I only feel enormous pain. Pain and emptiness. That's it.
And we actually know that Dan Zvanek's father was also fighting inside that steel plant complex. The family told us they hadn't heard from him since mid-March, so we reached out to our sources in that complex, other soldiers, and they managed to put Zvanek's father in touch with his family. He is still alive inside that complex, but those contacts that we have also managed to break the news to him that his son has now been killed. Just a horrific tragedy for this family, and also, the father that's still inside that plant. Eleni, that his fate moving forward remains very unclear.
Matt, so much loss and pain. Thank you so much for shedding light on these important stories. And still ahead, he is one of Asia's greatest footballers of all time. And last night, he proved why Tottenham is lucky to have him. Details in our sports update. Welcome back. Now, all this week, our new series Mission Ahead is introducing you to the innovators tackling our world's biggest challenges by taking on big, bold missions in science. And today, CNN's Rachel Crane sees how technology could, for the first time, replicate something that mothers do around the world as they have for centuries.
Courtney Miller is a mom of two and lactation consultant from Cary, North Carolina. It's her job to help parents breastfeed. But even for a professional, this is harder than it looks.
I was like, oh, I'm a mother-baby nurse. I've got this. Like, I've taught moms how to breastfeed. Surely I'll be fine. Well, I realized I only knew like the first 2 to 3 days. And then from then on, I mean, things change.
Oh, yeah. Biologist Leela Strickland knows how that feels. In 2009, she struggled to make enough breast milk for her child and had to rely on formula. Strickland wondered if she could create an alternative in the lab, one that's a lot more like mother's milk.
What would this mean for mothers and fathers and babies if you could produce human milk outside the body?
Over 10 years later, Strickland is getting closer to finding out. She co-founded BioMilk to develop cell culture technology. It's the same kind of process used to make lab-grown meat, but BioMilk is culturing human milk-making cells.
We're collecting cells from 2 different sources, the milk and from the tissue.
That milk contains many of the beneficial fats and proteins you normally only get from breasts, Strickland says. It's the first step towards a potential solution for parents who can't breastfeed their babies or access donated milk. But BioMilk is still a long way off from selling a product. At least 3 years, Strickland says. First, BioMilk needs to grow mammary cells at a much larger scale at a lower cost, and convince regulators that the product is safe for our most vulnerable humans, Strickland says. Even if BioMilk gets that far, the product won't be exactly the same as mother's milk, experts say.
Not all components of human milk are produced by the cells that are being cultured in these bioreactors. Most of the fatty acids, the fats that help brain development, they come from the mother's blood.
But Strickland believes BioMilk's work can also help further our understanding of breast milk, and that could lead to new scientific breakthroughs.
Well, breast milk is a collection of many thousands of molecules that all have beneficial effects throughout the human body.
It's enough to convince investors, like Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which hopes BioMilk's product will be more sustainable than formula. Miller, too. She's donating a few ounces of her own milk to BioMilk's research.
Some may see it as a replacement to breast milk, and I don't see it that way. I see it as just another choice.
Fascinating progress there. Okay, so the battle for the top 4 spots in the Premier League is keeping fans on the edge of their seats. Tottenham is one of the football clubs hoping to get there, and last night they played a cracking game against rivals Leicester. One man stood out. He is Spurs forward Son Heung-min. World Sport anchor Alex Thomas has the details for us. Alex, good to see you.
Yeah, hi, Eleni. I know it's Becky who's the Tottenham fan, not you, but at least you've got something to tell her when she gets back into the studio. But it is this massive race for 4th spot, that final Champions League qualification place in the Premier League. We know the title's close. There's also relegation issues, but this is yet another issue that has to be resolved before the end of the season. Just 4 games each for Arsenal and Spurs. It's fascinating stuff.
All right, we are going to get more on that story after the short break. Stay with CNN.
Hello, welcome to CNN World Sport. I'm Alex Thomas in London. We're down to 8 in the NBA playoffs, and the conference semi-finals got underway on Sunday with wins for the Warriors and the Bucks. Golden State's victory going down to the wire. Our own Andy Scholes has the details.
If Game 1 of this Warriors-Grizzlies series is an indication of what the rest of the series is going to be like, we are certainly in for a treat because Sunday afternoon's game was just fantastic. And we had a controversial play in the second quarter of this game. Draymond Green smacked Brandon Clark on this play, kind of pulled him down as well. And after reviewing it, the refs surprisingly gave Draymond a flagrant 2, which is an automatic ejection from the game. Draymond kind of danced around on his way to leaving the court. Now, Jordan Poole would start the second half in Green's place, and he came up huge for the Warriors. He had 31 points and 9 assists in this game. Under a minute to go, the Warriors were down 2, and Klay Thompson, the pump fake, then hits the 3 to take the lead. Then it was Steph Curry coming up with a huge defensive play as he blocked John Morant on this drive. Warriors still up by 1. Klay missed 2 free throws, so the Grizzlies had one last chance to win this game. Klay had just enough defense on that one as Morant's layup no good. Warriors win a thriller 117-116. Draymond greeting the team in the tunnel to celebrate taking a 1-0 lead in this series. And the win's great news for the Warriors in many aspects because they've won 12 straight series after taking Game 1.
The core, we got championship DNA, and we want to, utilize that at this stage. Like, that's what it's all about. You can never let go of the rope in terms of feeling like you're out of the game. So, big win for us to start the series with 1-0, get home court advantage, get greedy in the second game.
Yeah, the defending champion Bucks, meanwhile, didn't have Chris Middleton for yesterday's Game 1 against the Celtics. He's still nursing a knee injury, but two-time league MVP Giannis Antetokounmpo more than picking up the slack. Check him out midway through the fourth quarter, spinning around Grant Williams and throwing it off the backboard to himself for the alley-oop dunk. Giannis notching his second career playoff triple-double in this one. Milwaukee's defense shutting down the Celtics. They won this one easily, 101-89. Game 2 of that series is Tuesday night in Boston. And Alex, that series, the Celtics, they cruised to a victory over the Nets, sweeping them. Brooklyn, one of the worst defenses in the entire playoffs. The Bucks, a completely different story. We'll see what adjustments the Celtics are able to make heading into Game 2.
Andy Scholes with the pick of the NBA action. Now, everything is possible, says Inter coach Simone Inzaghi, as his team stayed in the hunt for the Serie A title with a 2-1 win over Udinese. The Nerazzurri showing yet again they won't easily give up on the defence of the Scudetto they won last year, taking the lead as early as the 12th minute through Ivan Perisic, and later in the first half earning a penalty that was initially saved and then scored on the rebound by Lautaro Martinez. His 21st goal in all competitions this season, equaling his best tally in a season for Inter. They hang on to win despite Udinese pulling one back in the second half. And the pressure was certainly on Inter because Serie A leaders AC Milan took all 3 points earlier in the day. A poor clearance from the Fiorentina keeper leading to the only goal of the game scored by Rafael Leao. That is another huge step towards their first title since 2011. It leaves AC Milan 2 points clear of their local rivals and the defending champions. Both clubs have 3 games to go, with Inter facing easier opponents and more home games, but also facing an Italian Cup final against Juventus during that run-in. Alistair Mackenzie's an Italian football expert based in Rome. He told me earlier that Inter's win under pressure was impressive.
Being up against mid-table opposition, which might on paper look like an easier result, you have to put it in the context of really the week before failing to take advantage of the game in hand that they've been waiting for since January against Bologna. They didn't take advantage of that. They lost 2-1 after a terrible error from the reserve goalkeeper, Jonat Radu, and that really put a spanner in the works after a run of good form. So, yeah, for them to be able to not only recover from that pretty galling results, but also see Milan win earlier in the day and then come out and do a very professional job. It was massive for them. 2-0 up by half-time. Obviously, a few nerves towards the end after Udinese got a goal back. But, yeah, like I say, I don't think you can underestimate how well they did to put in such a professional performance.
And from the outside, it's felt a bit like Inter's title defence was almost written off before it began when they were forced to sell key players at the start of the season, including Romelu Lukaku. In hindsight, do you think that narrative was a bit overplayed?
Well, I don't think it was overplayed, because when you lose a coach like Antonio Conte, who ended that very long 11-year wait for the title, they also lost Romelu Lukaku, who's arguably the catalyst for getting them that title in the first place. And then Achraf Hakimi, who is one of their other star players of that title run. Losing all those guys at once clearly made them less of a contender than they had been the previous season. But the thing they did brilliantly really was how sensibly, intelligently they recruited to replace those outgoings. They were never going to be able to bring in exact like-for-like replacements, but in getting a guy like Simone Inzaghi, who's an up-and-coming coach who played a very similar style of football in many ways to Conte at Lazio. He's come in, he's had continuity in terms of keeping the 3-5-2 system. Edin Dzeko's come in on a cheap deal from Roma, and no one really expected him to be as good as he has been in hitting double figures at his age particularly. But there's been a kind of level of continuity and sensible recruitment that's really allowed them to continue, I guess, more unaffected than people expected them to be. I think they've also benefited from the fact that there haven't been many obvious contenders to rip that crown off them. Still a developing Milan team. Juventus have really been on the slide in the last couple of years, a team really in flux. And Napoli, as we've seen in recent weeks, are far too unpredictable to be regarded as a massive title favourite. So they've benefited from the teams around them slipping up as well.
Yeah, and despite Inter maybe doing better with the defence of their title than some had predicted, they're still up against an AC Milan team enjoying their best season for a long, long time. They haven't lost in Serie A Milan since January. What do you think's been the secret to their consistency?
Well, as basic as it sounds, to be honest, I think that the team spirit is a massive part of it, because Stefano Pioli's done a great job of instilling this kind of togetherness in this team ever since he's been in the job. You've seen that in the last couple of weeks, and particularly the late goal against Fiorentina in a game they had to win on Sunday, but before then a 92nd minute goal against Lazio last weekend, where they came from behind to win 2-1. They do have this kind of never say die attitude in this team. And also they have struggled for goals, especially since the turn of the year this season. But in that run, I think it's 13 games unbeaten now since that defeat in January. Only one of those games has actually been won by more than one goal. So it goes to show that they're capable of getting these results in very tight games. They're not blowing teams away, but they have that togetherness. They have that consistency, I think, by now is a big thing for them, because they've had a very similar tight group together for quite a while now for Pioli to work with. So I think they know each other well, and they feel like their time is now.
Alistair Mackenzie with his expert view on the title race in Serie A. Now, tennis remains divided about banning Russian players over the war in Ukraine. Rafa Nadal, the latest to have his say, but it prompted a sharp response from one of his fellow pros. Hello, you're watching World Sport on CNN. Welcome back. The tennis world still seems divided over sporting sanctions relating to the war in Ukraine, with Rafa Nadal getting criticised for calling Wimbledon's ban on Russian and Belarusian players unfair. The decision not to allow players from those countries to compete at Wimbledon was announced last month and has received plenty of criticism. They are allowed into other events, but not under their national flags, whereas Wimbledon has gone a step further with a complete ban due to the invasion of Ukraine and Belarus's support of Russia. So, as things stand, stars like Daniil Medvedev and Victoria Azarenka won't be at the All England club in a couple of months' time.
It's very unfair for the players, for my colleagues. There's little they can do. What fault is it of theirs what's happening at the moment with the war? In that sense, as a teammate, I feel very sorry for them, and I wish it wasn't like that.
Nadal's comments not going down well with Ukrainian player Sergei Stakhovsky, who tweeted the Spaniard saying, "We competed together, we've played each other on tour. Please tell me how it is fair that Ukrainian players cannot return home. How it is fair that Ukrainian kids cannot play tennis. How is it fair that Ukrainians are dying?" Now, while the Chelsea men's team only have one win from its last 4 games, the club has notched up its 8th successive victory in the Women's Super League and need just one more to be crowned English champions for a 3rd year running. With closest rivals Arsenal winning 7-0 earlier in the day, the pressure was on Chelsea to respond, and they did, beating Birmingham 1-0 thanks to that second-half penalty from Danish midfield star Pernille Harder. Chelsea's lead at the top of the table is 4 points, so if Emma Hayes' team beat Manchester United next weekend, they will be champions once more. And in another sign of the growing popularity of the women's game, Newcastle United have smashed their attendance record. More than 22,000 turned up to watch the women play at St James's Park on Sunday. The previous highest was only 2,700 back in January. Newcastle winning 4-0, but they won't get promotion this season. Interestingly, they're in National League One North, which is 3 divisions below the Super League. Yet still attracting a huge crowd. Great to see. Eleni, back to you.
Alex, thank you so very much for that update. Good to see you. And we're going to a short break. When we come back, the second hour of Connect the World begins. Stay with us.
Live from CNN Abu Dhabi, this is Connect the World.
Welcome, I'm Eleni Jarkas. I'm in for my colleague Becky Anderson. This is Connect the World. We start with what the mayor of Mariupol is calling a very difficult process to evacuate Ukrainians from the besieged city. He says Russians are creating obstacles. At last report, evacuation buses had not arrived at a main assembly point. But Ukrainian officials are still hopeful more people can get out today. And that's all happening under a different set of circumstances than evacuations Sunday from the Azovstal steel plant. About 100 women and children managed to get out, which is great news, but a commander at the plant says 200 more civilians remain inside, along with hundreds more injured soldiers. He says the plant endured heavy shelling overnight, and for those that did make it out, relief at finally seeing daylight.
I can't believe it. 2 months of darkness. We did not see any sunlight. We were scared.
And for now, the Azovstal plant has endured relentless Russian attacks. These images show the damage it's endured over time. And this is from early March, near the start of the siege. 2.5 weeks later, the destruction is very apparent. By early April, large sections of the plant are still seen heavily damaged. And in this current photo, all that is left in one section is a burnt out shell of what once stood there. Meantime, Ukraine's Navy has released footage of what it says is a drone strike that destroyed 2 Russian Raptor boats in the Black Sea. It happened not far from Snake Island. Scott McLean is connecting us from Lviv in western Ukraine. Scott, really good to see you. Look, the Mariupol evacuations have been so important. We've been discussing this over the past couple of months, where you've seen efforts being hampered by, issues on the ground, whether it's logistics, whether it's the Russians, whether it's just bad planning. Is this finally changing?
Well, part of the issue that we've seen over the last few months is that the Ukrainians and the Russians couldn't seem to agree on the precise terms of any kind of humanitarian corridor. They couldn't agree precisely on the terms of a ceasefire, and it seemed like one side or the other would violate the ceasefire. There were good reasons in many cases why these humanitarian corridors were not working, but yesterday we got really the first glimmer of hope that there might be a more wider scale operation to allow people to leave the city, and specifically to leave that steel plant. So there are 2 kinds of evacuations happening today. There's people from the wider city, which, as you mentioned, they are at last word still waiting for buses to show up from a mall from a northwest part of the city where they're supposed to meet up and then be taken west toward Ukrainian-held territory. And then there are people in the steel plant. Remember that this is a Red Cross, United Nations-led operation to get them out. We know that 100 people, according to the Ukrainians, have boarded those buses en route to Ukrainian-held territory in the city specifically of Zaporizhia. But the last update that we got from the city's mayor is that it is extremely slow going. And the reason he cites for that is because people are being forced to go through this so-called filtration process, where essentially the Russians will question you and search you, and it can take a while in some cases. The mayor says that for average ordinary people, it can take up to a month on average. It's difficult to imagine it taking nearly that long considering the involvement of the United Nations and the Red Cross, but we still don't know at this point. We're also hearing from the Russians that some 200 people have gotten out, a mixture of people in the city and from the plant. We know that at least 21 people, again, according to the Russians, have chosen to go to Russian-held territory from that plant. Even if, Eleni, all of the civilians manage to get out, though, keep in mind that you still have soldiers in there. The mayor says that that issue is being negotiated separately at some of the highest levels.
I want to talk about the explosions that we've seen in Belgorod. I want you to give me a sense, and this is the 3rd type attack in as many days, and the Ukrainians have been very hesitant to say it was them. Could you give me an idea of the impact that it's having on the Russians and potential retaliation?
So the Russians have warned very clearly before, Eleni, that any attacks on Russian soil would be met with a very swift and strong response, and they warned the West and which they say, of course, are supplying weapons for the Ukrainians, and we know that to be true. And they warned Kyiv as well not to test Russia's patience because, as they say, they are determined to achieve their goals in what they describe as a special operation. But that doesn't seem to be fazing the Ukrainians or whoever is starting these fires or causing these explosions on Russian-held territory. And the reason that I say that is because the Ukrainians haven't exactly fessed up to these attacks. So there were 2 explosions earlier this morning, according to the local governor of Belgorod. There was just yesterday an attack on another military site that caused a fire that burned for more than an hour. And then last week as well, there was a fire at an ammunition depot in Belgorod. Plus, there have been other explosions and fires at fuel depots and other military sites. As I said, the Ukrainians not jumping up and down to say that it was them, but at least for the attack last week, they said that karma is a cruel thing. So you can draw your own conclusions, Eleni.
Absolutely, Scott. Thank you very much. We want to now take you to Zaporizhia. The city in eastern Ukraine is often where people evacuated from Mariupol go first. Our international security editor, Nick Payton-Walsh, is there and joins us now live. Nick, we spoke an hour ago. Anything that's changed on the ground?
Yeah, Eleni, what you're seeing behind me here, one of a number of vehicles, buses that have just turned up and a part of not this larger evacuation effort that the UN and Red Cross have been trying to pull off today, and may in the coming hours manage to get fully mobile. These are people who've come here on their own steam. Our cameraman Brice Lanier has just put the camera inside to show some people who are from Berdyansk and some from Mariupol as well, having endured not only the horrors of Mariupol itself, but also one woman there, just her back turned to us, describing the extremely difficult road they had on the way out of here. But this is just the beginning. This is not the effort that is awaited here with such extraordinary expectation. There are so many here who are trying to get their way out. In fact, we'll just turn around here so we can see the scenes behind us as people start coming out of their buses. Great emotion as they meet their loved ones and wonder quite what is next in store for them, their lives completely dislocated by this war. Now, I should say, back in terms of the broader effort here that the United Nations and Red Cross are trying to get underway here, this was something which Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said would be underway from 8 o'clock this morning, but there appear to have been some hiccups on the way, and as far as I understand, some of the buses have moved away from Mariupol and maybe in some of the towns on the road towards here at Zaporizhia, but they're not necessarily expected in daylight hours today, maybe overnight, maybe tomorrow morning. That may be the wiser bet for when they'll actually finally manage to begin that journey. But the Russian Ministry of Defense, take their word as you will, have said that over 100 evacuees have emerged from the Azovstal steel plant, and while 11 of them, they claim, have chosen to stay in separatist territory, 69 are on their way towards here, Zaporizhia. There are different groups of people trying to get out. There is, of course, so much attention, rightly, on the heavily bombarded kind of bunker, frankly, of the Azovstal steel plant, where hundreds have been hiding out of daylight, coming into daylight for the first time. Hundreds of injured Ukrainian soldiers still in that facility as well. And then there is the broader attempt to try and get tens of thousands of Ukrainians out of Mariupol generally. The 100,000 civilian population there risking the threat of disease now, of course, continued bombardment, Russian occupation as well. The hope is this UN convoy will be able to get going and begin a corridor which will more frequently increase the numbers of people managing to get out. But expectations had been high here today that we would start to see numbers pick up here as the day goes by, but I have to tell you, we're getting towards dusk and still it doesn't appear that their main UN convoy is imminently coming here, Eleni.
Yeah. Nick, great to have you on the ground there. Thank you so much. And for so many in Mariupol, the chance to escape came far too late. The city's mayor says more than 20,000 residents have been killed since the war began. It's a staggering number, and for those burying the dead, a seemingly endless and heartbreaking task. CNN's Sarah Seidner reports.
No tears, no remembrances, no final goodbyes, just dust to dust, and the burial is over.
We bury 50 people a day. Today, we've done 2 lots of 18 bodies and another 10, 46 in total.
Gravediggers like Danya can barely keep up the pace at the Starry Cream Cemetery in the outskirts of Mariupol. Ones marked with only a number, a sign the bodies have yet to be identified by family.
People come and find their loved ones and bring crosses and a board.
CNN is not present in the Russian-occupied Donbass, but footage we obtained and satellite images show dozens of fresh graves. Local authorities say about 600 in total, and this is not an isolated case. Images show graves have been dug en masse at two other burial grounds. This is one of them, Manush. They've been bringing bodies every day for a month, Anna says. They just keep bringing more and more, bit by bit. Here, too, footage shows rows of freshly dug graves and indications bodies have been buried before being identified.
Each body is given its own grave and a coffin and a board with a number.
A separatist soldier who did not want to be identified says,
After they are processed, the city funeral service works with the prosecutor's office to organize their burial.
CNN could not independently verify the claims, but local authorities say the majority of those buried here and in Starry Cream were killed during Russia's assault on Mariupol. Moscow has now seized control of most of this strategic port city, but some Ukrainian forces continue to hold ground at the Azovstal steel plant. So far, the Kremlin hasn't reported an official death toll, but Ukrainian officials say it's in the thousands.
By our optimistic estimation, more than 20,000 people, women, kids, elderly, died on the streets of our city.
The mayor of Mariupol says, because the death toll is bound to rise, at Manush, the work continues. About 100 freshly dug graves ready for the dead. As war rages, Ukrainians aren't just being murdered by strangers, but also buried by them. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Kyiv.
The International Monetary Fund says the war on Ukraine and Western sanctions against Russia are hurting other nations' chances of bouncing back from the economic harm of the pandemic, especially in the Middle East and Central Asia regions. The IMF says the war is complicating efforts to deal with high debt and inflation, and that steps must be taken to ensure food and energy security for vulnerable nations. Joining us now is the IMF's Jihad Azur. He oversees the fund's work in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, as well as Caucasus. Thank you very much. Jihad, really good to see you. I have to say, look, I've been talking a lot to the IMF, specifically over the very difficult times during the pandemic. And I know that so many resources were thrown at dealing with COVID. And I'm wondering whether there are any buffers left to deal with this kind of enormous exogenous risk that is now emerging in the world. And we're talking about food insecurity, we're talking about a rise in commodity prices, and the most vulnerable of nations, once again, specifically in this region, are at risk.
Well, thank you, Eleni, for having me. You're raising a very important question. Countries were recovering from COVID, and then they were hit by this shock that will change the outlook for this year. We will see countries who are, I would say, directly affected by the crisis in Ukraine, mainly Caucasus and Central Asian countries. Those will be affected directly through trade and financial channels. But others also are going to be affected because of increase in prices, inflation, and volatility in financial markets. Therefore, this year is going to be a challenging one, and this is why we had to revise outlook for both Middle East and Central Asian countries downward. But yet, I think it's important here to mention that we see a divergence between oil exporting countries who will compensate the increase in prices with increase in revenues coming from oil, and they will be less affected by capital outflows because of the windfall they got from the increase in revenues because of the increase in oil.
Yeah. So, Jihad, I'm glad you mentioned oil-producing countries, and you can see a very different sort of scenario and reality for oil-producing countries versus oil importers. Do you think it is the responsibility of oil-producing countries to increase output, to alleviate some of this enormous pressure that, again, is going to hurt the weak countries?
Well, of course, I think it's important to make sure that the markets are well supplied and there is no shortages in the market. I think here we need to differentiate between oil and gas. oil market is much more, I would say, liquid in terms of being able to provide additional sources of supply, while gas is more complicated because of the infrastructure. Currently, the demand is stable or a bit slowing down, and there is enough buffers in the system to supply that. However, when it comes to gas and it comes to diversity of supply sources, here where the issues may take time, you need infrastructure, and also you need to equip, especially in Europe, terminals to be able to receive gas.
So we also saw Egypt, and I want to talk about Egypt. It's such an important market and relies heavily on imports from Russia on grain. And importantly, Russia is a vital partner as well. Inflation in Egypt hitting 12%. We saw it last year at about 4.8% at one point. We've been hearing about people's plight on the ground once again. And central banks have this really tough dilemma. Do you increase interest rates like the Egyptians have done to try and create price stability at risk of economic growth? What does one do with very little tools left in the box?
Well, Egypt, prior to the war in Ukraine, was recovering relatively fast with an average growth for the fiscal year 21-22 of 5.8%, relatively high compared to other countries in the region. But they were directly affected by the war in Ukraine because of their dependence on wheat and also tourism from Russia and Ukraine. The central bank has started, as well as also using monetary policy tools, adjusting the interest rate by 1% of GDP and providing a social package through the budget in order to alleviate the pressure on the low-income people. Of course, those are steps in the right direction. And Egypt has proven in the past the capacity to address those shocks. We saw this in 2020 during COVID, and we saw this in 2016 when they did a certain number of reforms. But of course, many emerging markets that are affected by inflation, increase in interest rates, and the risk of slowdown need to make sure that they have the right policy mix in order to address these shocks.
Are you going to be worried about unrest because of food security issues? Is that a probability that you're thinking about?
Of course, this is an important issue because also you have to add to this that the COVID crisis eroded social stability because of the large number of people working in informality and the increase in unemployment. This is an important issue to address, and the way to address it through changing the approach of social policy. And this is more acute for low-income countries and fragile states in the region, who are more affected because of the increase in wheat prices than others, where, for example, this increase in prices could be higher than additional needs of 1 to 1.5% of GDP compared to an average of 0.3% need of additional resources to address the wheat crisis.
Okay, Jihad, I want to talk about the debt, unsustainable debt. The IMF has said that the food shortages could push countries to go for external financing in the region of around $10 billion in 2022. We've seen loans, concessional and non-concessional, because of the pandemic. Are we heading into an unsustainable debt scenario and a debt crisis playing out in various parts of this region?
I think here we have to take it on country-by-country basis. There are countries who have buffers and they are still, have the right policies to address those shocks. Others who have high level of debt and very little buffers. And for those, unfortunately, they need to maintain fiscal consolidation, but they can do it in a way. They redirect spending toward the low-income people by strengthening social transfers, while also addressing some of the equity issue by reforming their tax system. I think what is important here at this stage is to address issue of inflation in order to avoid disanchoring of inflation, support low-income people through targeted means in order to avoid that the increase in prices will hit social stability, and have the right macroeconomic tools and a medium-term reform approach.
Jihad, really good to have you on. Thank you so much. These are important topics, and I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more as the situation evolves. Really good to see you, sir. The Russian foreign minister's comments about Adolf Hitler have stirred outrage in Israel and Ukraine. Still ahead, why the Israeli foreign minister accuses Sergei Lavrov of the lowest level of racism. Ukraine is expressing support for the Jewish people and calling on other nations to isolate Russia even more after a top Kremlin official's comments about Adolf Hitler. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was trying to justify Russia's claim that it's denazifying Ukraine, even though President Vladimir Zelensky is Jewish. Lavrov told Italian television that Hitler had Jewish blood. The Israeli government and the World Holocaust Remembrance Center condemned the remarks. CNN's Hadas Gold joins us now live from Jerusalem with more on the reaction, inflammatory comments by Sergei Lavrov. Give us a sense of the response, Hadas, to these unfounded comments.
Yeah, Eleni, these comments are unfounded. They're also these sort of old conspiracy theories that he is putting out there as though they are fact when they are not. Now, the Israeli officials immediately came out with statements condemning the remarks. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett called them lies intended to accuse the Jews themselves of the most horrific crimes in history. And Foreign Minister Yair Lapid went even further, saying in a tweet that the remarks are both an unforgivable and outrageous statement, as well as a terrible historical error. He says Jews did not murder themselves in the Holocaust, calling it the lowest level of racism against Jews is to accuse Jews themselves as anti-Semitism. He went on in later statements to say that Israel has tried to maintain good relations with Russia, but that these comments have crossed a line and that he is calling on the Russian government to apologize. And when he's saying that Israel has tried to maintain good relations is throughout this war with Ukraine, Israel has been trying to have this sort of delicate diplomatic balance between the two countries. They've been trying to act as mediator. Naftali Bennett has been speaking with Zelensky and Putin on a regular basis. Israel also says it's concerned for the hundreds of thousands of Jews, both in Russia and Ukraine, and importantly, for Israel's own security. Because of Russia's military presence in Syria, Israel essentially needs Russia's tacit approval in order to be able to carry out strikes against Iranian targets in Syria, something that Israel says is very important for its security. Now, Israel has come out and condemned the invasion. They have accused Russia of war crimes. They've been giving Ukraine plane loads of humanitarian aid, but they have not yet joined the Western countries in imposing really harsh sanctions against Russia. Although they have said that Israel will not be a way to bypass Western sanctions, they have not yet signed on to them. So now the question will be, will remarks like these push Israel towards that move? Most likely not, but clearly it has riled them enough to say, listen, Russia, we've been trying to have good relations with you, but now you've crossed the line. Eleni.
Hadass Gold, thank you very much. U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is in Europe to rally support for the Ukraine war effort. On Monday, she and other members of U.S. Congress met with Polish President Andrzej Duda. Pelosi said the visit shows that the U.S. stands firmly alongside NATO allies in supporting Ukraine. Pelosi also led a congressional delegation on a surprise visit to Kyiv on Saturday, meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. CNN Capitol Hill reporter Melanie Zanona has more on Speaker Pelosi's European visit. Good to see you, Melanie. I mean, it's one thing visiting Europe, reinforcing the message that the U.S. is committed to assisting Ukraine, and another thing, convincing Congress to approve that enormous package to alleviate the pressure in Ukraine.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Nonetheless, members of Congress did want to use these high-profile trips to show their support for the Ukrainian people and reaffirm the United States' commitment to helping them fight this war. Speaker Nancy Pelosi and some members of Congress were in Poland today to meet with President Duda, and this comes on the heels of their secret trip to Kyiv, where they met with Ukrainian President Zelensky. While they were there, Congressman Adam Schiff said they heard about new needs facing the country. Take a listen.
We wanted to discuss with him within that really vast sum, what is the priority in terms of what weapons that he needs, what other assistance that he needs. So we went, through a detailed discussion of the next phase of the war. It's moving from a phase in which Ukrainians were ambushing Russian tanks. It was close quarters fighting, to fighting more at a distance using long-range artillery. And that changes the nature of what Ukraine needs to defend itself.
Now, Congress returns to Washington this week, and they will begin work on an additional aid package for Ukraine. President Biden has requested $33 billion in additional assistance. That is a huge sum of money. And Eleni, I can tell you there is broad bipartisan support for passing that package, but Democratic leaders are still deciding whether to link that with an additional bill for COVID relief money, which could slow things down. So really, it could be at least another week here before we see any action on that front.
Yeah, and there's so much urgency about getting that money to work. So, Melanie, something we'll keep an eye on. Thank you so very much. Good to see you. And just ahead, Europe's energy ministers hold an emergency meeting on Russia's demand it be paid in rubles. We'll speak to the EU correspondent for the Financial Times to help us understand this crisis. Stay with us. I'm Eleni Jakas in Abu Dhabi. Welcome back to Connect the World. EU energy ministers have been holding a crisis meeting in Brussels today after Russia turned off its gas supply to Poland and Bulgaria last week. Moscow wants energy payments in rubles to get around sanctions. Warsaw and Sofia said no way. Today, the EU is trying to come up with a unified response to Moscow's demand. For his part, the Ukrainian foreign minister tweeted that a Russian oil embargo must be included in the next round of EU sanctions. CNN's Claire Sebastian is watching all of this from London, and she joins us now live. Good to see you. Claire, watching these developments really closely, a sixth round of sanctions, a unified response, and of course you're actually seeing some countries going, listen, we are still reliant. We have to take a very different stance. And it seems that Germany is the big name here in terms of getting them on board.
Yes, Eleni, absolutely. Germany is Europe's biggest economy. It's the biggest, in absolute terms, importer of Russian energy. So if Germany is saying it's ready to move ahead with an oil embargo, which is potentially the next step that's being discussed under the sixth package of sanctions, then I think you can assume there's serious momentum. I want to just play you a clip. My colleague Julia Chatterley just spoke to the German finance minister Christian Lindner. Here's what he had to say about the topic.
Now we are ready. We have prepared ourselves to be less dependent on Russian energy imports. It takes time to reduce the dependency. It was a mistake to be dependent in this way. But we are making progress. We can reduce the imports, starting with coal, then oil. It will take more time to be independent from Russian natural gas imports, but we will continue. So in the end, we will be completely independent from Russia.
A measure, Eleni, of just how much has changed in 2 months. At the beginning of this conflict, Germany was saying that they really couldn't even countenance any kind of embargo on Russian energy. And here they are. They've reduced their reliance on Russian oil from 35% of their imports at the beginning of the conflict now down to 12%. And we have EU ministers today with an extraordinary meeting on Russian gas after Russia, cut off the gas to Poland and Bulgaria last week. They are planning things like energy storage, collective procurement, things like that. This is a situation where Europe is really trying to not only put on a show of unity, but really work together to sort of up their defenses, make sure that they are not defenseless if Russia does do any more moves like this.
And absolutely, and it's fascinating to hear, it was a mistake for Germany to be reliant on Russia, but one country's mistake is another country's opportunity. And you've actually seen, and we've discussed this, the emerging market space taking a very different stance towards Russia. India being such a vital part of that conversation, still buying Russian oil, buying fertilizer, other commodities, thinking about, making payment in rubles. And yet Narendra Modi is currently in Europe. What are the conversations that he's having with Olaf Scholz?
Yeah, first of all, and the extraordinary optics, as you point out, on the one hand, Germany, who's saying today that they would be willing to cut off their reliance on Russian energy. And on the other side, we have Narendra Modi. His country, India, has emerged, according to experts, as the biggest buyer since the beginning of the conflict of those distressed barrels, the oil that Western countries and companies have refused to buy because of reputational risks and so-called self-sanctioning. So the discussions today, look, we heard from them both in the press conference. Olaf Scholz, in very strong terms, condemned the conflict, condemned Russia, called for peace. Narendra Modi didn't actually mention Russia. He said, look, we want peace too. No one is going to emerge victorious in the conflict. In terms of actual concrete steps, it seems that Germany has committed around 10 billion euros to fund India's green growth. But I think, look, it's more about the visit itself, the meeting itself. This is part of efforts overall that we've seen from the Western Alliance, Europe and the Transatlantic Alliance, to sort of rally other countries into this sort of anti-Russian alliance that they've formed. India so far has sat on the fence. It remains to be seen whether any progress will have been made on that today.
All right, Claire Sebastian, thank you so very much. Good to see you. And moving on now, joining us is Andy Bounds, the EU correspondent with the Financial Times. to talk further about the next round of sanctions and then, importantly, Russia's big plan to get payment in rubles. Really good to see you, Andy. I mean, I want to talk about Russia insisting on getting paid in rubles, cutting off Bulgaria, cutting off Poland, and then Hungary saying, well, we're going to have to comply because we're just too reliant. In context of this meeting right now with energy ministers, do you feel and think that there is some kind of unity that's emerging between EU players?
I think on the gas question, it's really, really hard because countries like Hungary, as you say, are very, very reliant, and each individual country is making its own decision. Although they can be assured by others, we'll support you, we'll send you gas. Some of these have very limited infrastructure to take gas from other places. So they're really under pressure, and it's still pretty chilly here, and the industry needs gas. So I think there is actually quite a divide over whether to pay in It's effectively paying in euros, but then the euros get converted to rubles. Yeah. So some companies argue that's legal. The European Commission has been very clear that it's a breach of sanctions. Kadri Simpson, the Energy Commission,
it's murky waters.
Divide and rule tactic.
Absolutely, murky waters here. I mean, and it's also very creative accounting by the Russians. The oil embargo issue is also a really interesting one. And then in terms of Germany saying, look, it's always been a mistake to have this reliance on Russia. But in the sixth round of sanctions, having oil as part of that embargo, is that doable?
I think it is coming. There are still holdouts. Hungary, again, is a holdout. One or two other countries have their doubts. But now that Germany's moved and shown it's possible, it will be phased in. There's no question. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It'll probably be phased in towards the end of the year, so that it takes nearly a year to take effect, to the end of this year. And they will have to find alternative supplies. I mean, Robert Habeck, the German economy minister here today, was pushing this line, but he said we still need a bit of time to get our infrastructure sorted out before we can take this step. And it's going to cause pain as well. He was very clear. Consumers will pay more. Consumers in the US may pay more because the oil price may rise globally on the back of this move.
These sanctions are absolutely a double-edged sword. Russia has been very smart about trying to coerce countries into paying in rubles. What more can be read into, getting Bulgaria and Poland switching off the taps? We know it's such a small percentage in terms of overall Russian supply to Europe, but it's an interesting message by Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I think the EU is quite bravely sort of trying to call Putin's bluff here. So obviously they can top up Bulgaria and Poland, and Putin knows that. And in fact, the gas price has risen, and he may be making as much money as he was before, selling less gas. Of course, if he wants to turn off the whole of the EU, that's going to hit him in the pocket. And it's very hard to resend that gas elsewhere. It's coming through pipelines. So the EU and Russia are sort of in a high-stakes standoff over who's going to blink first. But it does require all those EU countries to line up and back the Commission's strong stance. And, we still see one or two waverers. So it's going to be fascinating over the next few days to see how it pans out.
Are the Europeans at all worried by the fact that you're seeing, and we've just covered this, that distressed oil barrels, or what they're calling toxic barrels of oil, are being sold to the Indians, and you're seeing emerging markets taking a very different stance to Russia? Is there concern about the sanction efforts by the Europeans being diluted by the rest of the world and other powerhouses taking a very different approach?
I think that there is a lot of worry about that and the practical effect of it, because if Russia can sell this oil elsewhere, Putin is still getting his money, and the EU is ending up paying, more for oil from elsewhere, while that oil is still sold. So it's politically something they feel they have to do. Some populations demanding it. The Baltic states are demanding it. Poland wanted an immediate switch off of all energy from Russia, as soon as possible. So they're sort of being dragged into it, and they're having to make it work. But it will cost them, and it may cost them more than it costs Russia.
I think you said something really important when you said, the infrastructure build, making plans, thinking about how they're going to wean themselves off. And this doesn't happen overnight. And you and I know this sort of infrastructure spend takes time. Move to renewables takes time. The impact, the economic impact is going to be absolutely enormous. And the prognosis is that we're talking about massive energy deficits coming through in Europe. Could you share with us some of the numbers, the quantifiable issues that are emerging here?
Well, there's a lot of analysis being done. The Commission publicly, all it will say is, we can probably survive recession. We won't go into recession. But oil prices are already high, gas prices are high, consumers are facing rises of up to 100% in some countries, including Belgium, where I am. So, it's definitely having an effect on farm prices because fertilizers depend on oil and gas to be made. But they just feel they have to tough it out because, otherwise they have no other weapons. They don't want to get involved in a shooting war with Russia. Energy is the one thing where they feel they can really, really damage. It's why it's taken so long. We're talking about a 6th package of sanctions, right? So the first 5 steered clear of energy because they realized how tough it will be for Europe to take that step. And as I say, around the world, because oil prices will affect everybody, throughout the world. We're all going to feel the effects of this. That's why they're phasing it in. I think it will be gradual in an attempt to try and keep the cap on that rise in prices and hope they can lessen demand, move to renewables. There's a massive package coming in the middle of May at how they're going to accelerate that move away from fossil fuels towards renewables. And it's a direction Europe was traveling in anyway, and they're going to have to go a lot further and a lot faster and spend a lot more money on it.
Yeah, there's a lot at stake, Andy. Thank you so very much for your insight. Great to have you on the show. When Connect the World continues, a historic first in the world of boxing, what it could mean for the future of women's sports in just a moment. A historic first over the weekend in sports. Ireland's Katie Taylor and Puerto Rico's Don. Good to see you. Amazing crowd, I have to say. Women's sports can pull the crowds, contrary to what we've been hearing. But listen, I want you to talk to me about the historic relevance of this match, and importantly, Taylor fighting back from a rough start. So this, excitement all around here.
Yeah, it was a huge night, Eleni. The build-up and the hype had been absolutely massive, and sometimes in sport, in any sport, these things just cannot live up to the hype. But this one did, and then some. It was a thrilling night. The atmosphere inside Madison Square Gardens was just absolutely extraordinary. It was packed, and it wasn't just that it was packed. It was the noise and the volume of the enthusiasm of the fans, and that built and built throughout the night. It reached a crescendo during the fight. It seemed as though the referee couldn't even hear the bell towards the end of the third round. That's how loud it was in there. As for the fight itself, Serrano seemed to make the better start, as you say. Taylor took a while to kind of get comfortable and find her footing, but she made her way back in the second half of the fight. And towards the end, in the final round, the two of them just were absolutely going for it. And in the end, it was close. We kind of knew it would be close given the respective records of these two boxers and their careers to this point. But it was close. The judges had to decide, and it was a split decision. Of course, Katie Taylor just edged it, meaning she remains unbeaten. And afterwards, she said it was the best night of her career.
The packed stadium, unbelievable stuff. This was absolutely special moment. The best night of my career for sure. I wasn't sure if anything could reach my Olympic gold medal moment, but tonight was absolutely the best moment of my career.
Yeah, Eleni, and I do wonder if there are going to be more moments like this now that fight fans and sports fans have a taste of what these guys can offer.
Absolutely. Cool. Don Riddell, thank you very much. Nice to see you. Now, the 1st of May brought May Day rallies to the streets of cities around the world to bring attention to workers' rights. A drum corps provided the beat for administrators in Mexico City. And in Paris, authorities say some 20,000 people took to the streets to mark the day, also known as International Workers' Day. The marches in Paris were mostly peaceful, but some clashes did break out. Police say 45 people were arrested. And in Honduras, protesters burned an effigy of former President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was recently extradited to the U.S. on drug trafficking and firearms charges. And there were similar scenes in Cuba, scores of people packing Havana's Revolution Square. Our Patrick Oppman reports it was a major show of support for the Cuban government.
Following a 2-year suspension due to the pandemic, government supporters once again took to the streets in Cuba to commemorate May Day. This is one of the largest gatherings of pro-government supporters throughout the year in Cuba. As it's called, a Workers' Day here is an opportunity for the government to whip up their support in Havana, bring in thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, according to the government's own numbers, to march through Havana's Revolution Square. And once again, while their leaders look down on them, show their support for the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban government. Cuba is still being battered by the effects of the pandemic, what it's done to the tourism economy here, and as well by the impacts of increased sanctions started by President Trump that have been continued under the Biden administration. Some critics said that Cuba should not carry out these mass celebrations due to the pandemic, the risks still presented by the pandemic, as well as the high cost in transportation and gasoline of busing in so many people to the Cuban capital. But clearly the Cuban government that has been stung by criticism, that has been on the defensive following unprecedented protests last July, felt that it was more important to make this show of strength and this show of support. Patrick Oppman, CNN Havana.
And next on Connect the World, we'll go back to Ukraine to see how ballet dancers in Lviv are trying to help mend their nation's grief and reclaim a sense of normalcy amid the war. The Lviv National Opera was forced to close its doors in February when Russia launched its violent assault on Ukraine. This weekend, it reopened for a ballet performance. Isa Suarez was there and has a look at how art is trying to help heal the shadow of the war.
Away from the front lines, an army of artists begin the process of mending this nation's grief. Gently repairing the hurt brought on by war. At Lviv's National Opera, everyone has a part to play. Tonight's Giselle Ballet will be the first full performance since the theatre closed its doors almost 2 months ago. As musicians dust off their instruments and as the audience starts to trickle in, for us, coming to the theatre is returning to a small part of our life, which was there before the war. We are internally displaced from Kyiv, says Julia Dmitrieva. We had to come to Lviv while there are hostilities. The artistic director tells me why they decided to open now. We understand that light must defeat darkness, that life must defeat death, and the mission of the theatre is to assert this. But the reminders of war are never too far away.
Dear guests, our event will be suspended in case of an air raid alert.
Only 300 seats were allowed to be sold tonight, the capacity of the opera's bomb shelter. Still, it's sold out.
It's only minutes now until that curtain opens and you can feel the tension because this performance is extra special.
For a few hours, nothing else matters. As the audience and I are transported to a world of love and beauty. Playing Giselle tonight is 21-year-old Irina. It feels great, she tells me back in her dressing room, because dancing helps to distract from what's happening. Like many here, her life has been shaken by war and the horrors of Bucha, where mass graves were recently found. My mum and my grandmother and her sister survived occupation in Bucha, she tells me. Now she's in safety in Poland, restoring her nerves. Darina finds solace on this stage, throwing herself behind her character. All the negative emotions which accumulate for a long time flow out, she tells me. A cathartic performance for both those on and off stage, offering comfort to those who need it most, in the hope they can lift, if only just briefly, this nation's aching soul.
A magnificent performance there. And I also want to bring you a powerful moment from New York's Metropolitan Opera over the weekend. Well, that's Ukrainian soprano Lyudmila Monastiriska, who performed in the title role of Turandot, then took a curtain call draped in the Ukrainian flag, as you can see there, and she replaced famed Russian star Anna Netrebko, who was cut off from the performance after she refused to publicly distance herself from Vladimir Putin after Russia invaded Ukraine. Incredible. Muslims around the world are marking Eid al-Fitr. In tonight's parting shots, we see communal prayers in Jakarta, Cairo and Jerusalem, ending the holy month of Ramadan. The pandemic forced many of the larger mosques to shut down for last year's celebrations. And after prayers, there are feasts and festivals. And here you see the Syrians enjoying carnival rides in Idlib. And we want to wish Muslims around the world Eid Mubarak. Thanks so much for joining us. One World with Zain Asher is up next. I'm Eleni Jarkas. Take care.
Hello everyone, I'm Zain Asher in New York and this is One World. Ukraine says Russia is pressing forward in its eastern offensive and heading towards a key town vital to controlling the Donbass region. Sloviansk is surrounded on three sides by Russian-held cities, and capturing it would allow Moscow to cut off Ukrainian troops in the Luhansk and Donetsk areas. Fierce battles are taking place along the front lines, but Kremlin forces are only making modest gains right now. Ukraine's military, meanwhile, may be focusing on logistical sites and supply lines inside Russia, though they have not acknowledged cross-border attacks. 2 explosions were reported in Belgorod, Russia, early Monday. It comes one day after a large fire at a defense ministry complex. And new video shows a Ukrainian drone strike on 2 Russian boats in the Black Sea. Moscow has yet to comment. In war-ravaged Mariupol, civilians desperate to leave after weeks under siege are finally getting a chance to do just that. Dozens left over the weekend, but progress is slow, and the mayor says Russia is creating obstacles. 2 different rescue operations are set to take place. One involves tens of thousands of people who are trapped inside the bombed-out city. The other includes more evacuations from the Azovstal steel plant, which are supposed to resume today. The first group of evacuees from that plant are set to arrive in Zaporizhia, and that's where CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh joins us live now. So Nick, you can only imagine just how harrowing the past 2 months have been for some of these people, many of whom have been underground. Just walk us through what they're telling you.
Absolutely. Look, point out, Zain, they've not arrived here at this stage. And actually what you're seeing behind me here is part of a steady flow of cars that have come into the evacuee sort of filtration or welcome centre here in Zaporizhia. Now, as I say, we don't know who these people are. They've just turned up. I would doubt that they are part of this broader United Nations convoy and effort, because we understand they may be a matter of hours away, possibly not even reaching here in daylight. A lot of people have been coming from the areas around Mariupol or Mariupol itself with a more complex journey that's taken them weeks, in some cases days, in many of those who we've spoken to here as well. And that may be what you're seeing coming in here behind me. But the key part of today and the expectations building around it, Zain, has been about getting people out in this broader United Nations and Red Cross backed effort, coordinated it seems with the Kremlin head and in Kiev as well, to be sure that the 100,000 civilians that are there that need to get away from the threat of disease and shelling and Russian occupation, frankly, can do so. Foremost of those, the 100 or so in the Azovstal steel plant that we know may be on the move at this point. The Russian Ministry of Defense, take their word as you will, have said that over 100 have got out in the last 48 hours from that steel plant that has been so heavily bombarded. There have been some very harrowing images, frankly, of them, people emerging into daylight and seeing the devastation, frankly, of their hometown for the very first time. But we understand 11 of those, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, have chosen to stay in separatist territory, and 39 are on their way here, though it does appear to have been a very slow journey, and one, according to 2 officials I've spoken to here, that may have caused them to perhaps overnight or at least be held up at towns on the way from Mariupol to where I'm standing here in Zaporizhia. But this has been a scene that's been playing out all day, as I say, not in itself that specific larger humanitarian convoy. It's so important that the UN and Red Cross managed to establish this because it gives the possibility of volume. This has been a drip that we've seen happening over the past days. Прошу прощения, вы откуда приехали? Where did you come from?
Запорожская область.
Запорожская область, да? Ну как, so, хорошо, все okay? You okay? Yeah, this is sort of slight sigh of relief and smile of relief we've been seeing over here. They're from not Mariupol, but the nearby regions around here. But as I say, a drip that we've been seeing happening slowly over today as people arrive from the regions all around Mariupol and here Zaporozhye. Remember, the war is taking place across large swathes of eastern and southern Ukraine, causing people to be displaced and on the move. But I should just point out again, Zain, the hope later today, perhaps during the night, I think more likely at this stage tomorrow morning, is that we'll begin to see these first evacuees from the Azovstal plant coming into here, maybe elsewhere in Zaporozhye, and then the hope will be that will open a wider convoy. But it's enormously complex because of the continued fire that appears to have picked up overnight, according to Ukrainian officials, around Mariupol. And of course, because of the absence of trust between the Ukrainians and Russian sides here after Russia's unprovoked invasion of the country and intense shelling of Mariupol over the past weeks. Back to you.
Yeah, those people have been through so much, really the unimaginable. Nick Payton-Walsh, live for us there. Thank you so much. Mariupol has become a symbol of this war's brutality and the horrors inflicted on ordinary citizens going about their everyday lives. Local officials say that more than 20,000 people there have been killed since the Russian invasion. The attacks are relentless. And as our CNN's Sarah Seidner reports, there's no break in the violence, not even to bury the dead.
No tears, no remembrances, no final goodbyes, just dust to dust, and the burial is over.
We bury 50 people a day. Today, we've done 2 lots of 18 bodies, and another 10, 46 in total.
Gravediggers like Danya can barely keep up the pace at the Starý Krym cemetery in the outskirts of Mariupol. One's marked with only a number, a sign the bodies have yet to be identified by family.
People come and find their loved ones and bring crosses and a board.
CNN is not present in the Russian-occupied Donbass, but footage we obtained and satellite images show dozens of fresh graves. Local authorities say about 600 in total, and this is not an isolated case. Images show graves have been dug en masse at 2 other burial grounds. This is one of them, Manush. They've been bringing bodies every day for a month, Anna says. They just keep bringing more and more, bit by bit. Here, too, footage shows rows of freshly dug graves and indications bodies have been buried before being identified.
Each body is given its own grave in a coffin and a board with a number.
A separatist soldier who did not want to be identified says,
after they are processed, the city funeral service works with the prosecutor's office to organize their burial.
CNN could not independently verify the claims, but local authorities say the majority of those buried here and in Starý Krym were killed during Russia's assault on Mariupol. Moscow has now seized control of most of this strategic port city, but some Ukrainian forces continue to hold ground at the Azovstal steel plant. So far, the Kremlin hasn't reported an official death toll, but Ukrainian officials say it's in the thousands.
By our optimistic estimation, more than 20,000 people, women, kids, elderly, died on the streets of our city.
The mayor of Mariupol says, because the death toll is bound to rise, at Manush, the work continues. About 100 freshly dug graves ready for the dead. As war rages, Ukrainians aren't just being murdered by strangers, but also buried by them. Sarah Seidner, CNN, Kyiv.
Not long after civilians were evacuated from the Mariupol steel plant on Sunday, Ukrainian commander told CNN that Russia carried out more attacks. He said the complex was hit with all kinds of weapons, but that things have actually calmed down, quieted down since then. He also said that hundreds of people are still trapped inside, including service members who were wounded in Russian attacks last week. We are also hearing a very disturbing report about the fate of a Ukrainian soldier captured from the steel plant. CNN's Matt Rivers joins us live now from Kyiv with more. So Matt, what more do we know?
Yeah, so as we watch this good news of civilians being evacuated from the steel plant, from other parts of Mariupol, questions abound about the fate of the soldiers that remain inside that steel plant. And if the question is, well, will they ever surrender to the Russians? I think we can safely say the answer, at least for now, is no, especially given the story that we're about to show you. Russian propaganda with a clear message to the last remaining defenders of Mariupol. The video says, we guarantee that we will save your lives and we will follow international laws to guarantee humane treatment. Such will be the case, says the voiceover, with this man, a captured Ukrainian soldier, Dan Zvanek. The 25-year-old member of Ukraine's territorial defense force was captured at the Azovstal steel complex, the last remaining pocket of resistance in the city. CNN has geolocated the building behind them to an area just northwest of the plant. A Russian soldier detailing how they'll be treated. As you are captured, he says, we will treat you with honor and with understanding. These videos were published on April 20th. 5 days later, Don Zvonek was dead. This picture of his face, hauntingly lifeless, was sent to his mother by officials in Russian-held Donetsk, she told us. We redialed the numbers and were hung up on once we identified as journalists. To confirm who he was, they also sent a picture of his chest with the tattoo on the body clearly matching the one seen on Zvonek when he was still alive in Russian propaganda videos.
When you first saw that message, what went through your mind?
Nothing. I just screamed. There was nothing. No thoughts.
We met his mother near where she's staying in Kyiv. She fled Mariupol herself just 2 weeks ago alongside the rest of her family. Her sister-in-law also reeling from the photo of her nephew.
I still have that photograph in front of my eyes. It's constantly in front of my eyes.
A morgue in Donetsk confirmed to CNN that Zvonek was dead and that his body was picked up on Sunday. His family says there was a large wound in the back of his head. CNN can't confirm how he died, but we know he died after being taken into custody, either by Russian or Russian-backed separatist forces.
Do you think that the Russians killed your son?
Yes, I'm sure.
Russia's Ministry of Defense did not return a request for comment about how Zvonek died. For weeks, CNN has heard directly from soldiers inside the steel plant complex who've told us they will not surrender to the Russians for fear of being executed. Within their ranks, Zvonek's death only hardened that sentiment.
Does what happened to him only reinforce the notion that the soldiers that are there are not going to surrender to the Russians?
Matt, don't you think it confirms their fear and actually expectations, what Russia did today? This is a war crime.
We asked Zvonek's mother, Anna, if she is angry with the Russians. Her answer, honest and gutting.
For now, I only feel enormous pain. Pain and emptiness. That's it.
And we actually found out in talking to the family that Zvonek's father was also inside that steel plant fighting alongside his son. The family had not heard from the father since the middle of March, so we actually spoke to our contacts inside that steel plant complex. They managed to get the father in touch with the family, so that is a good thing. He is still alive. He is now in touch once again with his family, but our contacts also broke the news to him that his son has been killed, and the father's fate himself is very much unknown given what's happening in Mariupol here. So just an incredibly difficult time for this family here in Kyiv.
Unbelievable, especially just gut-wrenching when you were speaking to his mother there. Matt Rivers, live for us there. Thank you so much. US First Lady Jill Biden will travel to Europe this week to show support for Ukrainian refugees. On Saturday, she'll meet with aid workers and educators in Romania, which has seen the second largest influx of refugees in Europe. She'll also visit Ukrainian refugees in Slovakia as well. The UN says more than 5.5 million people have fled Ukraine since the war began. Over the weekend, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi became the most senior U.S. official to meet with President Zelensky in Kyiv since Russia's invasion. She was also joined by other senior Democrats as well. The group talked about Ukraine's security, assistance, and rebuilding the country at some point. Pelosi also pledged U.S. support, vowing that America will stand by Ukraine until the fighting ends. The lawmakers also traveled to Poland, where they met today with Poland's president in Warsaw. CNN congressional correspondent Jessica Dean is on Capitol Hill for us. So let's talk about what Nancy Pelosi discussed with President Zelensky. She obviously showed support in terms of the U.S. support for Ukraine, but also had very, very harsh words for the Russians as well. Just walk us through that, Jessica.
Yeah, she certainly did, Zain, and we just got her latest statement. They have just concluded their visit now to Poland and Ukraine. She says that she and her delegation are returning here to the capital, inspired to do everything they can to help Ukraine in its fight against Russia. We know that probably also includes $33 billion that President Joe Biden has requested from Congress for aid for Ukraine. Right now, those talks are going a little bit slow, though, because the House is out for the week. So they're not even in session. The Senate is. We're expecting those talks to pick up steam more once the House returns to work next week. But let's go back to Nancy Pelosi on the ground there in Ukraine over the weekend. Again, this was an unannounced trip. In fact, we're learning that members of the delegation, when they took off for what they thought was simply going to Poland, they didn't even know they would be going to Ukraine. That's the type of security that was built in around this, as the highest-ranking U.S. official traveled in to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky in Kyiv. Let's listen to a little bit of what she had to say. Here's Speaker Pelosi.
Do not be bullied by bullies. If they're making threats, you cannot back down. That's my view of it. That we're there for the fight, and you cannot fold to a bully.
We are not interested in stalemates. We are not interested in going back to the status quo. The United States of America is in this to win it.
And we're told that they talked about military aid. They talked about humanitarian aid and what the U.S. could continue to do to help Ukraine in its fight against Russia. And Zane, we're also finding out that House Republicans were invited to go on this trip, some House Republicans. But at the time, again, as I said, they were told it was simply a trip to Poland, and they declined. They didn't know that they would be going to Ukraine. We have reached out to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, but we have not heard back yet. But that is why you saw only Democrats making this trip to Ukraine. And again, now the work is in front of them as to actually make good on all of these promises they've made, the discussions that they've had with President Zelensky. They've got to get back here and find a way to get that aid passed and get it to Joe Biden's desk. Zane?
Jessica Dean, live for us there. Thank you so much. The EU has paid tens of billions of dollars for Russian oil and gas since the war began, but now a potentially game-changing announcement. Germany says it is ready to agree on an embargo on Russian oil imports. CNN's Julia Chatterley spoke exclusively with Germany's finance minister earlier. I want you to listen to what he had to say.
Now we are ready. We have prepared ourselves to be less dependent on Russian energy imports. It takes time to reduce the dependency. It was a mistake to be dependent in this way. But we are making progress. We can reduce the imports, starting with coal, then oil. It will take more time to be independent from Russian natural gas imports, but we will continue. So in the end, we will be completely independent from Russia.
EU energy ministers are in Brussels today holding crisis talks amid fears that Russia will cut gas supplies to more countries that refuse to pay in rubles. It's what Russia did to Poland and Bulgaria just last week. The EU is moving towards a ban on Russian oil imports by the end of the year. Claire Sebastian joins us live now from London. So Claire, it was interesting to hear the German finance minister basically saying that, listen, we have made a mistake. We have made a mistake by being so dependent on Russian energy. Obviously, the meeting today is about Russian gas, but there is momentum building towards an oil embargo. Just walk us through where things stand right now.
Yeah, so Germany is the key player here. They are the biggest economy in Europe. They are the biggest importer of Russian energy in absolute terms. So when the German finance minister says, look, we're ready to go, and we heard the same thing, Zain, from the German Minister for Economy and Climate today at that meeting of EU ministers. So look, it appears that they're ready. I think they would prefer a phased-in approach when it comes to oil. Certainly that seems to be where the talks are centering in Europe. It would be easier for them if they had a little time. But they have taken big steps already to reduce their reliance on Russian oil. They were at 35% of imports when the war started. Now they're at 12%. Apparently that affects just one refinery in one region near Berlin. So the economy minister said earlier that would be a local problem. It would be painful. It could lead to higher prices. All consumers are going to have to, make a contribution to this, but they are ready to go. They say they want to do it. But Europe is not yet united on this. There are holdouts like, for example, Hungary that have said it is not ready to go ahead and ban Russian energy.
And Claire, just in terms of, as you point out, Hungary and countries like Slovakia that are very, very dependent, how long will it take those countries to transition away from Russian energy, do you think?
So originally, Zain, at the beginning of this conflict, the EU had set a target of 2027 for being fully weaned off Russian energy. That includes oil, coal, and gas. Look, people are clearly trying to accelerate their plans because, frankly, they have to. This is now getting really real. What Russia did last week, cutting off gas to Poland and Bulgaria, sends a signal to Europe that they could potentially go further, even though, of course, to some extent, Russia would be shooting itself in the foot by doing that because of the amount of money they make from their energy exports. But this is going to require some serious decisions from Europe. They're going to have to invest in infrastructure to bring in liquefied natural gas, pipeline infrastructure. And if you look at gas, it's not just going to be supply issues. You just cannot replace Russian gas. So they're going to have to look at reducing demand as well, energy efficiency, renewables, things like that. Difficult decisions because, of course, they're under pressure now to fill up their gas storage before we get to the point where we don't have enough for winter, Zain. So I think we've moved to the point where this is beyond just a hypothetical for Europe and now an emergency.
All right, Claire Sebastian, live for us there. Thank you so much. And just want to remind our audience that we are expecting any moment now to hear from energy ministers in the European Union who are going to be talking about what Claire was just talking about, this potential oil embargo on Russian energy. We will bring that to you as and when we have it. All right, coming up, temperatures in parts of India are the highest in a century, while Pakistan is also suffering under the extreme heat. More on the climate crisis affecting South Asia when we come back. Countries that refuse to pay in rubles. Let's listen.
To suspend supply of gas to Poland and Bulgaria. The energy ministers reiterated their unity and solidarity as a group of member states. And we are glad to see this strong response. We all firmly condemn the decision by Gazprom to suspend the supply of gas to Poland and Bulgaria, and we would like to reiterate that all suppliers should stick to the conditions of the contracts that they have committed to, and we hope to see a joint harmonised response which will respect the contracts that have already been agreed. And the Commission has already published some guidance on this. And during our meeting we also examined the impact that these decisions will have in Poland and Bulgaria. Our colleagues from those countries told us that there will be no immediate interruption of gas supply for users and industry, and we will continue to monitor this closely. We will have a regional task force, and they will be working in Sofia from the 5th of May. The action by Russia has only strengthened our determination to become more independent from fossil fuels coming from Russia, as we agreed on our Council meeting at the start of March. And we need to continue the EU's existing efforts to become more resilient. We also took stock of the EU's preparations for the upcoming next winter, determined now to coordinate more, ensure security of supply for all member states. And in practice, this will mean better filling of our gas stores, finding alternative suppliers, and ensuring ongoing monitoring of the situation. For gas stores, member states have all launched their gas filling campaigns, and we want to ensure that we coordinate as much as possible. This is another reason why we are trying to continue work in the Energy Working Party to work on the gas regulation, hoping to see a swift adoption through trilogue soon. And at the end of May, we will see the presentation of the Repower EU Commission plan, which will help us to reduce the EU's energy dependence on Russia. Member States are working closely with the Commission to ensure that we can set up a joint gas purchasing platform, which will allow us to make significant progress. We want to closely coordinate our work on finding alternative methods of gas supply, and it should allow us to keep prices stable as well. Member States and Commission have decided to continue exploring measures to protect EU customers and users against price hikes. The EU is preparing actively in order to work together. Following the conclusions from the 24th and 25th of March Council, we have shown today that Member States are united and stand in solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you also for convening this extraordinary council meeting at this crucial moment. The decision by Gazprom to suspend the gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria marks another turning point in the current crisis, and it is an unjustified breach of existing contracts and a warning that any member state could be next. It is also an attempt to divide the EU, to which we must respond by reinforcing our unity and solidarity. And the Commission has provided guidance to the Member States on the issue of payment in rubles. We made clear that this is a unilateral change to contracts, unjustified by commercial reasons, and it is perfectly legitimate under commercial law to reject it. We have explained that payments in rubles lead to a clear breach of sanctions, as they provide assets for the operation of the central bank. Nevertheless, many European energy companies are due to make their next payment to Gazprom in mid-May and are trying to understand better what they should do. And we need to give them the clarity that paying in rubles through the conversion mechanism managed by the Russian public authorities and a second dedicated account in Gazprom Bank is a violation of the sanctions and cannot be accepted. The Member States and the companies should not have any illusions that they can rely on the good faith of Gazprom and the Russian regime in this matter. The Council today underlined the importance of unity and coherence of our response, and I have promised the ministers that my services, together with the legal service of both the Commission and the Council, will prepare a more detailed guidance on what the companies can and cannot do within our sanctions framework. At this stage, this is no immediate risk for Europe's security of supply. For now, deliveries to Poland and Bulgaria continue via alternative routes from Greece and Germany. I thanked earlier today everyone involved for their help and solidarity. Yesterday, the gas interconnector between Lithuania and Poland, a 10-E project of common interest, began operations, and this could not be more timely. Other projects nearing completion, such as the Baltic Pipe in October and the interconnector between Greece and Bulgaria, will also play a crucial role. While the flows via Ukraine and Yamal routes to the EU have fallen, they represent today only a limited portion of gas imports to the Union, and all the alternative routes are at their maximum capacity, and LNG reached last week record high levels of 0.4 BCM per day. The level of storage in Europe is over 32%, and increasing in all countries. That said, our priority must now be preparedness for any disruption of the flows. And I have indicated to ministers that, in my view, we must focus on 3 areas. First, we need to upgrade the gas supply contingency plans. All member states have preparedness measures in place, but they need to fully reflect the recent developments and security of supply risks. We have to look at the European level coordination of the demand curtailment measures in the plans, as well as the optimal use of gas networks and energy infrastructure. It is also urgent to conclude bilateral solidarity arrangements. Let me therefore welcome the new bilateral solidarity agreement reached last week between Estonia and Finland. There are still too few of them, and I urge member states to speed up work for the remaining bilateral agreements. The second priority is to ensure the refilling of European gas storage by the next heating season. To make this happen, it is important to swiftly adopt the proposal on storage and to ensure that the final outcome guarantees storage levels of 80% this year and 90% after that. Work is progressing rapidly, and dialogues are scheduled for the 16th of May. And I'm very grateful for the work done by the presidency for seeking a reasonable compromise and taking into account the specific situations of the member states. Finally, we must urgently continue the work to diversify supplies through the EU energy platform. The first meeting of the platform took place already on the 7th of April, and the first regional meeting on 12th and 13th of April. And the platform can help member states address the current challenge on the gas market. For instance, last week, the Commission and Bulgaria agreed to set up the first regional task force to deal with security of supply issues after Gazprom's breach of the supply contract. The first high-level meeting of the task force will take place already this Thursday in Sofia, where we have also invited our partners from the Western Balkans. In fact, the EU Energy Platform will be open to the EU's Eastern associated partners and the Western Balkans. We have also made progress in implementing the joint statement by the President Biden and President von der Leyen from 25th of March. On 28th of April, the EU-US Task Force on Energy Security met in Washington and will continue work on the senior officials level. In this context, it is imperative that we take forward our work to become independent from Russian fossil fuels. Accelerating the European Green Deal is essential to achieving this objective, because we cannot simply replace 155 BCM of Russian gas with fossil gas from other suppliers. It is neither sustainable nor affordable, so we need to speed up the deployment of renewable energy, including green hydrogen, and to increase energy efficiency and savings. And we will cover all these elements in the Commission Repower EU plan, which we will present ahead of the May European Council, with concrete measures to achieve the phase-out of Russian fossil fuels. And in the same package, the Commission will present its assessment of how to improve the current electricity market system, following the ACER report published last Friday. And finally, I have updated the ministers on progress in supporting Ukraine, which remains our key priority. We are entering in a very difficult phase of the Ukrainian war, and also for Europe's energy markets. And as President von der Leyen has said, work on sanctions that include the energy sector is ongoing. Now more than ever, we need to remain united in our approach and coordinated in our response. And I believe that today's Council has helped us consolidate this unity and coordination. And I thank again Barbara for making this possible. Thank you.
All right, EU energy officials gathering in Brussels there for a press conference condemning Russia's decision to cut off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria, basically saying that it is a clear breach of contract, also condemning Russia's demand to be paid in rubles, saying that that is, of course, a violation of sanctions. I want to bring in Claire Sebastian, who's joining us live now, who is also listening to this press conference. So, Claire, what stood out to you here?
So, Zain, a couple of things. One is that I think, as I was saying before, this is now an urgent stage for Europe. They said, look, this is what Kadri Simpson, the EU Energy Commissioner, just said. She said we're in a very difficult stage in the Ukraine war. But I think this is also a very difficult stage for Europe, because what Russia did last week, cutting off the gas to Poland and Bulgaria, has really brought this home. The commissioner said, look, this was a warning to the rest of Europe. It could happen to any of us, and we need to be ready going into winter. And we heard both from her and from the French Minister for the Ecological Transition, Barbara Pompili, that they need to do more coordination. The EU needs to work together more on things like gas storage, on joint procurement plan. Don't forget, if the EU works in concert, all 27 members, they can have a lot of market power, and that can help them stabilize prices for the entire bloc. Because, of course, one of the byproducts of cutting off energy imports from Russia, if that is eventually what happens, is that could lead to price rises as they look for alternative suppliers. And the other thing that's important to note, Zain, that stood out is that this is not going to be just about replacing Russian supply. There is going to have to be demand curtailment. That means all sorts of things, from reducing the amount of air conditioning that people are using in the summer to dropping speed limits on motorways and things like that. That is the only way that they can make an eventual embargo on Russian gas work, because there just simply isn't spare capacity in the gas market. But what we heard just now was that there is momentum. She said we are moving ahead on talks on potential sanctions on energy. That is essentially what the EU believes is necessary to do in order to potentially try to end the conflict in Ukraine.
Right, Sebastian, live for us there. Thank you so much. Ukraine and Israel are blasting Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov after he claimed that Adolf Hitler had, quote, Jewish blood, and that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews. Lavrov made the assertion on Sunday when asked to defend Russia's plan to, quote, denazify Ukraine. He shrugged off the fact that its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is Jewish, saying that his ancestry means nothing because, as he put it, Hitler also had Jewish blood. Israel's prime minister condemned Lavrov's comments on Twitter, saying, quote, the goal of such lies is to accuse the Jews themselves of the most awful crimes in history which were perpetrated against them, and thereby absolve Israel's enemies of responsibility. Time now for the exchange, where we're analysing Lavrov's comments and Russia's intentions in this war. Joining me live now is Ben Judah, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council who has written extensively about Russia and Vladimir Putin. Ben, thank you so much for being with us. When you think about the outrageous comments that Lavrov just made about Hitler having Jewish blood, I mean, it's unthinkable. We know that Israel has been somewhat on the fence in terms of taking sides in this war. Does this change that?
What the Russian government's obscene commentary, which isn't just an insult to Israelis and the state of Israel, it's an insult to Jews worldwide to make this kind of commentary. What they're doing here is that they are once again undermining any lasting sense of possible neutrality in Israel, or any lingering sense of doubt, or any lingering goodwill over history, or maybe cooperation over Syria, which has existed in certain political circles in Israel. What the Russian government's choice to embrace this kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric is doing in Israeli politics is making it so that it's not seen as a positive thing anymore for a politician in Israel to claim acquaintance and connection with Vladimir Putin and powerful figures in the Russian regime.
And when you think about this sort of obsession that Russia has with pushing this line about the denazification of Ukraine, how is that narrative playing out within Russia, just in terms of garnering more support for the war?
Well, what's happening across Russia, across Russian society, and across Russian airwaves is a dramatic, non-stop propaganda campaign, which in some senses began in Putin's first attack on Ukraine in 2014 and has dipped slightly and now returned with a vengeance, which is to make it so that all enemies of Russia, anyone who contradicts Russia, anyone who dares stand against the Putin regime is simply labeled a Nazi. And right now in Moscow, there are these eerie posters which have the Victory Day and the dates of the Second World War and the dates of today, implying that it's one struggle, one continual action that Russia is waging against its enemies today and yesterday, all of whom are Nazis. And this is succeeding in a very depoliticized and a very sort of alienated society in whipping up, to a certain extent, support for the regime and for the campaign in Ukraine.
You brought up Victory Day. I mean, obviously, that's a huge holiday in Russia. There's massive celebrations every May 9th. How might the course of the war change, or how might the strategy that Vladimir Putin is using in this war change as we approach May 9th in about 7 days from now? Do you think that date will have an impact?
I don't think that date will have a major impact. I think that there's been a lot of fixation on that date from abroad. But one of the things that I think is happening here is that May 9th, the victory against Nazism in World War II, was really something that brought Russian society together, that Russian society had to be proud of, and that was seen as a really sacred thing in Russian culture. And what Vladimir Putin is doing is taking that and then despoiling it in order to justify war in Ukraine, in order to justify repression at home and hostilities and a state of Cold War against the West. And one of the reasons he's chosen to do this, he's chosen to cloak the campaign against Ukraine in this language of Nazism, is because he knows that the Russian people have warm feelings towards the Ukrainian people traditionally, historically, and up until only a few months ago, that was the view of almost everyone in Russian society. And they don't want to think that they are at war against Ukraine. That's why he's chosen to create this demon, this of Nazism, which they are supposedly fighting, and is, of course, a lie.
That's why he's going to extreme lengths in terms of the narrative and the rhetoric as well. I know you mentioned that Victory Day, there's likely not going to be this sort of dramatic change in course of the war, but do you think at least we will see the beginning of more of an escalation in this war beyond the Donbass region, let's say?
Well, Russia has a lot of very important decisions to make in the weeks ahead. Some of them it may make around May 9th, but I wouldn't stress that date is a sort of crucial cutoff point in Putin's thinking. If the offensive in the Donbass continues to sputter and terrain is not gained, if those armies continue to be exhausted, then there's the question of, will Russia need to do a national mobilization or a partial mobilization of its reserves? Now, that's something that Putin has hesitated. He's, of course, famously made it illegal to say that what is happening is a war, because Putin knows full well that when a society mobilizes, pulls people out of the reserves and starts to conscript into a great endeavor and then loses, it can be a very dangerous moment for the regime. So Putin is going to have to work out what's his priority and what strategy is he going to take to preserve the regime if that offensive stalls or it even begins to be pushed back in Donbass. Is he going to take the risk of mobilization, which Russian society might not like, or is he going to take the risk of another failed offensive and possibly pushback, meaning there will be limited gains from this whole war, despite the amazing and terrible casualties which the Russian army has taken?
Ben Judah, live for us there. Thank you so much for being with us. Right, still to come here on One World, reunited, and it feels so good. New Zealand opens up to travellers after more than 2 years of the pandemic. A blistering heat wave has been battering much of India and its neighbor Pakistan, putting millions of lives at risk as scientists link the early onset of an intense summer to climate change. Temperatures in India soared in April to more than 37.7 degrees Celsius, breaking a 122-year-old record for the month. The extreme weather has forced schools to close, damaged crops, and put pressure on energy supplies as well. CNN meteorologist Chad Myers joins us live now from Atlanta. So Chad, experts are saying this really tests the limits of human survivability. Walk us through that.
It truly does, because we're only in April. I know it's May now, but these big temperatures that we had were last week, and those were well into the middle and upper 40s, so taking care of the pets and the animals as well. The satellite picture for Copernicus satellite can actually see the temperature of the ground, not just the clouds or the air, but seeing some spots here across parts of India and Pakistan to in the ballpark of 62 degrees C. That will burn your feet as you're walking on it, pets' feet as well. Temperatures are going to be hot again even today. We had 47 as the highest number. This is the coolest couple of days here now for the next few, but they've had 7 consecutive days in a row above 40 in New Delhi, 19 days in April alone above 40, and your normal high should never get above 39 or almost 40 degrees, and that is in the hottest part of the year before monsoon actually begins. And that's what we're waiting for. Monsoon, June 15th, somewhere in that neighborhood, when the winds begin to shift. That's what monsoon means. Monsoon doesn't mean rain. Monsoon means a wind shift. And that wind shift will bring in humidity. It will bring in cooler air, and it will bring in cloud cover, and it will bring in, obviously, the rainfall. But it's not going to get here for some time. Usually the last week of June, and then all of July, all of August, and even most of September, we get to see those clouds and the rain come through. Those are the life-giving rains of India. They make the crops grow. And they talked about how the crops were stressed. They had 8 degrees above normal in April when these plants were supposed to be just coming up from seed. And that really hurt them. 650 passenger trains were canceled so that they could put coal trains on the tracks so that they could get coal to the power plants, because the power plants are so stressed. No rain in sight for a while. Zane.
Gosh, that is insufferable. All right, Chad Myers live for us there. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
New Zealand is back on the world map. Those words from the tourism minister as the country opened up to travellers from dozens of countries. There were heartwarming scenes, tears of joy, and hugs as well, as families were reunited. Many, by the way, for the first time in 2 years.
Until today, I had never been within 6,000 miles of this country, and my first time here, I'm home.
We're just returning. I just went home to see my parents for the past 3 weeks. It was incredible. It was, yeah, it was unreal. End of a long nightmare, really.
What was it like seeing your parents?
It was, yeah, it was surreal, really.
Oh, so emotional. All right, New Zealand had, by the way, some of the toughest curbs in the world during the pandemic. We'll be right back with much more. All right, breaking news just into CNN relating to Russia's involvement in European football. Let's bring in CNN Sports' Don Riddell, joining us live now from Atlanta. Don, this is breaking news just coming to us. What more do we know at this point?
Yeah, literally just hearing in the last few minutes, Zane. In fact, I was coming in here to talk about something else, but now we're talking about this. Yeah, so UEFA is European football's governing body. Russian football had been suspended since the invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, but now following an executive meeting, they've taken it one step further. So to run through some of the things that this will now impact, the women's European Football Championships in England this year coming up. Russia are now out of that tournament. The team they beat in the playoffs to get there, Portugal, are now in. So the Portugal women's football team becoming a very lucky loser in that regard. Russia has been banned from bidding to host the European Football Championships in 2028 and 32. There will be no Russian football clubs involved in any UEFA competition next year. So that's the Champions League, the Europa League, the Europa Conference League. Russia's involvement in the Nations League, that's Russia as a country as opposed to a club. Essentially, they will no longer participate. So they will be relegated from their group because they will finish bottom of it. So that's pretty much what we know at the moment. I'm sure there's going to be lots of reaction to that. But European football's governing body, UEFA, taking some very, very strict action on Russia as a country and their football clubs too.
Yeah, and some other news that's sort of tangentially or loosely related. We obviously know that Russian and Belarusian tennis players have been banned from Wimbledon, but now you've got some of tennis's biggest stars speaking out about this, and obviously there's controversy too.
Yeah, huge controversy. And, you know, this is something that a lot of people have been talking about, and there doesn't really seem to be a right answer on this one. Wimbledon, of course, recently taking this big decision to ban Russian and Belarusian players, which impacts some very big players. The world #2 men's player, Daniil Medvedev, US Open champion, Arina Sabalenka, the world #4 from Belarus. They won't be at Wimbledon. Some players have come out criticizing that, including Novak Djokovic, Andy Murray, who, by the way, is basically playing for Ukrainian charities this year. And Murray is donating all of his prize money towards charities in Ukraine. And Rafael Nadal, the 21-time Grand Slam champion. This is what he said earlier today at the Madrid Open.
It's very unfair for the players, for my colleagues. There's little they can do. What fault is it of theirs what's happening at the moment with the war? In that sense, as a teammate, I feel very sorry for them, and I wish it wasn't like that.
So let's just bring in some reaction to that. Let's talk about the Ukrainian tennis player Sergei Stakhovsky. He's not a Ukrainian tennis player anymore. He retired earlier this year, and now he fights for the Ukraine army. He addressed Rafa Nadal in his comments and he said, "Please tell me how fair it is that Ukrainian players cannot return home. How fair is it that Ukrainian kids cannot play tennis? How fair is it that Ukrainians are dying?" Many Ukrainian sportsmen and women, and tennis players in particular, are very supportive of Wimbledon's position. It's a difficult one, isn't it? The players that we've been hearing from, Nadal, Djokovic, Murray, they all have their point too. There are no winners in this. But Wimbledon is sticking to their guns. They have taken this action because they do not want the involvement of Russian and Belarusian players at Wimbledon to be used as a part of Russian propaganda.
Yeah, they said they simply cannot have that. All right, Don Riddell, live for us there. Thank you so much. It was touch and go for a couple of white lions who were trapped in a zoo in Ukraine for 6 weeks while fighting raged all around them. But thanks to the manager of the Odessa Zoo and his deputy, these two 6-year-old lions were saved. The men drove nearly 18 hours, avoiding precarious front lines to pick up the big cats from the Kharkiv Echo Park and transport them to Odessa. The lions are named after Lion King characters Mufasa and Nala, and now they're getting settled in their new home. All right, thank you so much for watching One World. I'm Zain Asher. Amanpour is up next. You're watching CNN.